In the soft light of a Roman dawn in the year 509 BC, the city awoke to something it had never experienced before. For the first time in its history, going back through 7 kings to Romulus himself, more than 200 years earlier, Rome had no king, which admittedly was a strange feeling, rather like waking up to discover that gravity had been suspended, or that the sun had decided to rise in the west just to see what would happen. It wasn't that monarchy was necessarily good or bad, it's just that it had always been there, as fundamental to Roman existence as the 7 hills themselves. And now, suddenly, it wasn't. The previous day had been remarkable, transformative, chaotic. Lucius Junius Brutus had stood in the forum holding a bloody knife, had sworn an oath over the body of Lucretia, had called upon the Roman people to expel the Tarquins and end the monarchy forever. The crowd had roared its approval, the royal family had fled, and just like that, after an evening of chaos and celebration and confusion, the Romans had gone to bed as subjects and woken up as citizens. But what exactly did that mean? The question hung in the air as merchants opened their shops, as farmers brought produce to market, as ordinary Romans went about their morning business while glancing nervously toward the Palatine Hill, where the royal palace stood empty. The old order had collapsed, the new order had been proclaimed. But in the cold light of morning, the practical details seemed somewhat less clear than they had in the revolutionary fervour of the previous day. So, one merchant said to another as they set up their stalls in the forum, speaking in low voices despite the absence of the king's informers, "Who's in charge now?" His companion shrugged, arranging his pottery with the careful precision of a man trying to pretend everything was normal. "Brutus, I suppose, and Collatinus. They were proclaimed as, what did they call it? Consuls. What's a consul? I don't know. Someone important, apparently. Someone who gives orders but isn't a king. How is that different from a king? I don't know that either." The first merchant frowned, setting down an amphora with perhaps more force than necessary. "Well, that's helpful. We've overthrown the entire government and no one knows what we're replacing it with." "We replaced tyranny with freedom," his companion said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Brutus said so yesterday. Very inspiring speech." "Yes. But what does freedom actually look like on a Tuesday morning when you need someone to settle a contract dispute?" It was a fair question, and one being repeated throughout Rome that morning. The theory of the revolution had been clear enough. The Tarquins were tyrants, monarchy had failed, Rome needed a new system. But the practice, the actual mechanics of how this new system would work, remained frustratingly vague. A group of women gathering water at one of the public fountains were having a similar conversation, their voices low and worried. "My husband says we'll all regret this," one of them murmured, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "He says Rome needs a strong king, that without one we'll be conquered by our enemies." "Your husband," another woman replied sharply, "didn't have to watch Sextus Tarquinius walk free after what he did to Lucretia. Some things are worth the risk." "I'm not defending the Tarquins," the first woman said quickly. "I'm just saying, we've never not had a king before. How do we know this will work?" "We don't," a third woman admitted, setting her water jar on the fountain's edge. "But we know the old way didn't work. At least this gives us a chance to try something different." Throughout the city, in markets and workshops, in the houses of the wealthy and the cramped apartments of the poor, Romans were wrestling with the same uncertainty. They had acted on emotion yesterday, on justified rage and the desperate desire for change. But now, in the practical light of day, they had to figure out what came next. In the royal palace on the Palatine Hill, though it could hardly be called royal anymore, a few servants moved through empty rooms, uncertain whether they still had jobs or should simply leave. They packed away the personal belongings that the Tarquins had left behind in their hasty flight, boxed up the robes and jewels and documents that had belonged to the last king of Rome. One servant, an old man who had served in the palace for decades, paused in what had been Tarquin's private chamber. He looked at the empty throne, the abandoned desk where the king had signed decrees, the bed where Tarquin had slept. 44 years, he said to a younger servant helping him. "I've been in this palace for 44 years, serving 3 different kings, and now there's none. Is that good or bad?" the younger man asked. The old servant considered this. "Ask me in a year," he finally said. "If we're still here and Rome hasn't descended into chaos, I'll say it was good. If the city's burning and we're all slaves to some foreign conqueror, well then perhaps we were too hasty." "That's cheerful." "I've lived through 3 kings, boy. You learn not to make predictions too quickly. History has a way of surprising you. In the Curia Hostilia, the Senate house where just days before Tarquin Superbus had thrown the aged Servius Tullius down the steps, The senators gathered for what might have been the most important meeting in Roman history. They came warily, uncertain of what to expect, unsure even of why they had been summoned, or who had the authority to summon them. The building itself seemed different somehow, though nothing physical had changed. Perhaps it was simply the absence of royal guards at the door, or the way the senators entered without the usual deference to a king's presence. They took their seats on the stone benches, their white togas gleaming in the morning light streaming through the high windows, and waited to see what would happen. Lucius Junius Brutus stood before them, no longer wearing the mask of stupidity that had protected him for so many years. He looked tired. He had not slept the previous night, had spent it securing the city, ensuring the palace was emptied, making certain the Tarquins could not return in the confusion. His eyes were rimmed with red, and there was a tightness around his mouth that suggested exhaustion barely held at bay through force of will, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Senators of Rome," he began, and paused, considering his next words carefully. "I have called you here not as your superior, but as your equal. I have no royal authority to command you. I have only the trust you place in me, as someone who has sworn to serve Rome rather than rule it." This was a radical statement, the kind of thing that would have gotten you executed under Tarquin. Kings commanded, kings decreed, kings announced decisions and expected obedience. They certainly didn't speak about being equals with their senators. Several of the older senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was uncharted territory, and many of them had spent their entire political careers learning to navigate the dangerous waters of royal favour. Now, suddenly, the rules had changed, and no one was quite sure what the new ones were. "We have driven out the Tarquins," Brutus continued. "We have declared that Rome will never again submit to a king. But we cannot simply have no government at all. A city needs leadership, needs someone to make decisions in times of crisis, to lead the army, to represent Rome to other cities. We need order, but order that does not require us to surrender our freedom." "What do you propose?" asked one of the senior senators. A man named Spurius Lucretius, Lucretia's father, who sat in the assembly wearing the white of mourning, his grief for his daughter evident in every line of his face. His voice was hoarse, as though he had been weeping, which he probably had. "I propose," Brutus said, "that we create a new form of government. Not monarchy, where one man rules for life. Not chaos, where no one rules at all. Something in between. A government where the people, through this Senate and through assemblies, choose leaders for limited terms, where power is shared, checked, balanced against itself. And what would we call these leaders?" Another senator asked. A younger man named Marcus Horatius, who had fought in several of Tarquin's campaigns and had the scars to prove it. "If not kings, then what?" "I suggest we call them consuls," Brutus replied. From the Latin consulari, to consult, to take counsel. Leaders who must consult with the Senate, with the people, who rule by persuasion and law rather than by fear. The word had a nice ring to it. Consuls, not kings who commanded, but officials who consulted. It suggested a different relationship between ruler and ruled, one based on mutual respect rather than enforced obedience. "And how many of these consuls would there be?" Lucretius asked. "Two," Brutus said firmly. "Always two, never one. Each with equal power, each able to veto the other's decisions. This way, no single man can become another Tarquin. If one consul tries to exceed his authority, the other can stop him. If both agree on a course of action, it's because the policy truly serves Rome rather than personal ambition." It was clever, really. The whole structure was designed around the principle of preventing another Tarquin, dividing power so it could never be concentrated in one person, creating checks and balances, ensuring that multiple people had to agree before anything important could happen. An elderly senator named Titus Larsius raised a hand. "A practical question, if I may. What happens when the two consuls disagree? If one says we should go to war and the other says we should make peace, how do we resolve it?" "They must persuade each other," Brutus answered. "Or they must bring the matter to this Senate for advice. The system is designed to force cooperation, to make it impossible for one man to drag Rome into war, or peace, or any other major decision without broad support. So it will be slower," Larsius observed. "Less efficient than having a single king who can make decisions quickly." "Yes," Brutus admitted. "It will be slower. But Tarquin was very efficient at making terrible decisions quickly. Sometimes slowness is a virtue, especially when it prevents hasty actions that we might regret." There were murmurs of agreement at this. Many of the senators had watched helplessly as Tarquin made impulsive decisions, executions, confiscations, wars, without consulting anyone or considering the consequences. A system that made such snap judgments more difficult seemed, in retrospect, rather appealing. And these consuls, another senator asked, would they serve for life like kings? No, Brutus shook his head emphatically. 1 year. They serve for 1 year, then return to private life. This way they remain accountable. They know that in 12 months they'll be ordinary citizens again, subject to the laws they themselves enacted. It encourages them to govern justly, to think about the long-term good of Rome rather than their personal benefit. 1 year seems very short, someone objected. Barely enough time to learn the job, let alone accomplish anything significant. Perhaps, Brutus conceded. But remember, these consuls will have this entire Senate to advise them. Will have the collective wisdom of Rome's leading families to draw upon. They won't be making decisions in isolation, the way Tarquin did. And if a year proves too short, well, the people can re-elect the same men. Good leadership can continue, bad leadership ends quickly. The senators murmured among themselves, debating, questioning. Some were skeptical. This was too radical, too uncertain, too different from everything they knew. The weight of tradition pressed down on them. 2 centuries of monarchy whispering that this was madness, that Rome needed a king, that trying to govern without one would lead to disaster. Others were intrigued by the possibilities. These were often younger men, or those who had suffered personally under Tarquin's rule, who had seen their property confiscated, or their relatives exiled. For them, any system that prevented another Tarquin was worth trying, even if it was imperfect. Still others were simply relieved that someone was proposing any kind of structure at all, because the alternative was chaos, and chaos in a city surrounded by potentially hostile neighbours was a recipe for conquest and destruction. And who? Lucretius asked quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. Would you propose as Rome's first consuls? Brutus had been expecting this question. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. The people acclaimed Collatinus and myself yesterday, in the aftermath of the revolution. If this body agrees, if the citizens in assembly agree, we would serve as the first consuls. We would establish the precedents, create the procedures, show Rome how this new system can work. There was logic to this. Brutus and Collatinus had led the revolution, had the people's trust, had demonstrated their commitment to ending tyranny. Who better to create a government designed to prevent tyranny's return? But there was also risk. How did they know Brutus and Collatinus wouldn't simply become new tyrants, using their revolutionary credentials to establish a different form of dictatorship? And after your year is complete, someone asked. What then? Then the people elect new consuls, Brutus said, perhaps from among former consuls if they served well, or perhaps entirely new men. The choice belongs to the citizens, not to us. We serve at their pleasure, and when our term ends, we step down. No exceptions, no extensions, no excuses. You're asking us to trust you, observed an older senator named Publius Valerius, a man known for his careful, measured approach to politics. No, Brutus corrected him gently. I'm asking you to trust the system. I'm asking you to trust that a government of laws and procedures and checks and balances will protect Rome better than any individual, however well-intentioned. If Collatinus and I abuse our power, you can remove us at the end of our year and elect others. The system survives regardless of who holds office. It was a remarkable proposal, one that would reshape not just Rome but the entire future of Western civilization. A government of elected officials rather than hereditary rulers, limited terms instead of lifetime appointments, shared power instead of absolute authority, accountability to the people instead of divine right. Of course, none of them knew just how revolutionary this truly was. They were simply trying to solve a practical problem, how to govern Rome without a king. They couldn't have known that they were creating a template that would influence democratic governments for thousands of years to come, that philosophers and statesmen and revolutionaries would study this moment and draw inspiration from it, that the very word republic would come to represent an ideal of human freedom and self-governance. They were just tired Romans trying to make sure yesterday's revolution didn't collapse into chaos today. The Senate debated for hours. Some objections were practical. How exactly would 2 equal leaders make decisions? What if they disagreed on everything? Wouldn't that paralyze the government? How would military command work with 2 commanders? What about diplomatic negotiations? Who would speak for Rome? Other concerns were more fundamental. Was Rome abandoning the gods' chosen form of government? The kings had always claimed divine favor, had consulted the auspices, had presented themselves as mediators between Rome and the gods. Would Jupiter be angered that his city had rejected the kingship he had sanctified? Would the other gods withdraw their protection? The gods care about virtue and piety, not about titles, Brutus argued when this concern was raised. We will still consult the augurs, still perform the sacred rites, still honor Jupiter and Mars and all the gods who protect Rome. We're not rejecting divine authority, we're rejecting human tyranny. I believe the gods will approve. It was impossible to know if this was true. Of course, the gods had an unfortunate tendency to keep their opinions to themselves until after things went wrong, at which point priests would helpfully explain that obviously the disaster was divine punishment for whatever impiety you wanted to attribute it to. But Brutus's argument had a certain logic to it, and in the absence of thunderbolts or other clear signs of divine disapproval, the senators chose to accept it. But gradually, as the day wore on and the shadows lengthened across the curia floor, consensus emerged. Not because everyone was entirely convinced, but because everyone recognized that they needed to move forward somehow. The Tarquins were gone, that much was certain, and sitting around debating theoretical perfect systems while the city had no leadership at all was a recipe for disaster. By late afternoon, the Senate had approved Brutus's proposal. The structure of the consulship was agreed upon. 2 officials, elected annually, with equal imperium command authority, each able to veto the other, responsible for military command, administrative oversight, and execution of the laws. The Senate would advise them and ratify or reject major policies. The popular assemblies would elect the consuls and vote on legislation. It wasn't perfect. There were obvious potential problems. But it was workable. And more importantly, it was acceptable to enough people that Rome could move forward. The next step was to formalize this in the assembly, the gathering of Roman citizens who would ultimately approve or reject this new system. Brutus called for the Curiate Assembly, one of the traditional assemblies of the Roman kingdom, organized by the old family-based curiae, to meet the following day. We will present this to the people, Brutus announced as the Senate session drew to a close. We will ask them to approve this new government, to elect the first consuls, and to swear an oath that never again will Rome submit to a king. The decision must be theirs, freely made, so that no one can say this republic was imposed by force rather than chosen by free men. The senators filed out of the curia as the sun began to set, each lost in his own thoughts about what had been decided, and what it might mean for Rome's future. Some were hopeful, others anxious, still others simply exhausted by the day's debates and ready to go home to their families and a cup of wine. That night, Rome was quiet but tense. People stayed close to their homes, uncertain what morning would bring. Would the Tarquins try to return with an army? Would the new system collapse into chaos before it even properly began? Would the gods show their displeasure at the overthrow of sacred monarchy? Brutus himself finally allowed himself to rest, collapsing onto a couch in his home with a weariness that went bone deep. His wife brought him bread and cheese, which he ate mechanically, barely tasting it. "Do you think it will work?" she asked quietly, sitting beside him. "I don't know," Brutus admitted. "I hope so. But I honestly don't know. We're trying to create something that's never existed before, at least not quite like this. Maybe it's brilliant. Maybe it's madness. We'll find out. And if it fails, then we'll be conquered by our neighbours, or we'll descend into civil war, or we'll end up with another tyrant who's smarter than Tarquin about consolidating power." He rubbed his eyes tiredly. "But if we don't try, if we just accept that tyranny is inevitable, then we've already failed. At least this way we have a chance." But the gods, if they had opinions on the matter, kept them to themselves. And morning came peacefully, with no thunderbolts from Jupiter, no omens of doom, just another ordinary Roman dawn with merchants and farmers and craftsmen going about their business in a city that was trying very hard to pretend it knew what it was doing. The Curiate Assembly gathered in the Forum, under a sky of perfect blue, the kind of flawless weather that Romans would later interpret as a sign of divine approval, though at the time it just seemed like a fortunate break from the autumn rains that had been threatening for days. The Curio, announced on the ancient family groups that had organized Roman society since Romulus's time, sent their representatives, men who would speak for their extended families and vote on behalf of their people. It was an impressive gathering, hundreds of Romans filling the Forum, their white togas bright in the morning sun. The Forum itself had never looked quite like this before. Under the kings, assemblies had been largely ceremonial affairs, called to ratify decisions already made, to acclaim choices already determined. The people had attended because attendance was expected, had voted because voting was traditional, but everyone had understood that the real decisions were made elsewhere, in the palace, by men who didn't need to ask permission. This felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that what happened here today would actually matter, that the people's voice would carry weight rather than simply echo royal pronouncements. Some came because they genuinely supported the revolution and wanted to participate in creating Rome's new government. Others came because they were curious, or worried, or simply felt they should witness this historic moment. And still others came because not coming might look suspicious, might suggest loyalty to the expelled kings, and that seemed like a good way to get yourself in trouble. The representatives of the 30 curiae took their places in the front of the assembly, each group clustering together, heads bent in quiet conversation as they discussed what they had heard about yesterday's Senate meeting, what they thought of Brutus's proposals, what they planned to say when called upon to vote. "My grandfather," one young man was saying to his fellow curiate members, "fought for Tarquin Priscus. He always said the Tarquins were good for Rome, that they made us strong." "Your grandfather," an older man replied dryly, "died before Tarquin Superbus murdered Servius Tullius. He didn't live to see what the family became. Still, overthrowing the entire system of kingship. Not just one bad king who came from a family of kings," another interrupted. "The system produces tyrants. Brutus is right. We need something different." Similar conversations were happening throughout the assembly. Romans weighing tradition against innovation, stability against freedom, the known dangers of monarchy against the unknown risks of this new republic. Behind them, ordinary citizens filled the forum. Those who weren't members of the curiae, but who had come to watch, to witness, perhaps to shout their approval or disapproval depending on how things went. Merchants had closed their shops for the morning. Workshops stood idle. This was too important to miss, too historic to ignore. Whatever happened here would shape their lives and their children's lives for generations to come. Brutus stood on the rostra, the speaker's platform, with Collatinus beside him. Behind them, providing both symbolic and practical support, stood other leading men of Rome: Publius Valerius, who had been among the first to support the revolution; Spurius Lucretius, Lucretia's father, his presence a constant reminder of why this revolution had been necessary; various senators who had committed themselves to the new order. They presented a united front, showing the assembly that this revolution had broad support among Rome's leading families, though Brutus noticed, with some amusement, that not all the senators had chosen to stand visibly with him. Some had found urgent business elsewhere in the city this morning. Others had developed sudden illnesses that prevented their attendance. Still others had come but positioned themselves at the back of the crowd, close enough to claim they had supported the Republic if it succeeded, far enough to claim they had merely observed if it failed, which was fair enough, really. Political survival required a certain flexibility, and Brutus couldn't fault men for hedging their bets when the future was so uncertain. He raised his hands for silence, and gradually the murmur of conversation died down. Hundreds of faces turned toward him, expectant, worried, curious. He could see hope in some eyes, fear in others, skepticism in still others. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him like a physical thing. "Citizens of Rome," Brutus called out, his voice carrying across the forum, strengthened by the acoustics of the space and by practice speaking over the noise of crowds, "you have come to decide the future of our city. Will we continue as we began yesterday, free from tyranny, or will we turn back, call the Tarquins to return, submit again to the rule of kings?" It was a rhetorical question, really. After what Sextus Tarquinius had done to Lucretia, after years of Tarquin Superbus's harsh rule, there was no serious appetite for restoring the monarchy. But Brutus understood that the form mattered, that this decision needed to be made formally, with proper procedures, so that no one could later claim the Republic was imposed by a few conspirators rather than chosen by the people. He could see a few heads shaking vigorously at the suggestion of calling back the Tarquins. One man even spat on the ground at the mention of their name, which was perhaps excessive but understandable. "We have proposed a new system of government," Brutus continued, and proceeded to explain the structure of the consulship, the role of the Senate, the rights and responsibilities of citizens. He spoke clearly, without the revolutionary fervour of 2 days before, making it sound reasonable and practical rather than radical and dangerous. He explained how the two consuls would share power equally, how each could check the other's ambitions, how they would serve for only 1 year before returning to private life. He described how the Senate would advise, and how the assemblies would retain the right to approve or reject major decisions. He painted a picture of a government where power was divided, balanced, constrained by law and custom, rather than concentrated in the hands of one man. "Some of you," Brutus said, "will worry that this system is too new, too untested. And you're right to worry. We are attempting something that Rome has never tried before. But consider this. We know for certain that monarchy can fail. We've just lived through that failure. We don't know if a republic can succeed, but we know it can't possibly be worse than what we've just escaped. There was a murmur of agreement at this. Several men nodded, acknowledging the logic. Others will say that Rome needs a strong hand, a single leader who can make decisions quickly and enforce them decisively, and in times of crisis, you may be right. That's why we've included provisions for emergencies. In times of war or grave danger, the consuls can appoint a dictator, a single leader with absolute power. But even this dictator serves for only 6 months, and when the crisis ends, he must step down and return power to the regular government. No more lifetime kings, no more unlimited authority. This was actually a clever addition that had come up in yesterday's Senate debate. The idea of a temporary dictator, someone who could act decisively in emergencies, but who was constitutionally required to give up power afterward, addressed one of the main concerns about the unwieldiness of shared authority, while still preventing the accumulation of permanent tyrannical power. The Senate has approved this system, Brutus continued. Your senators, the men you trust to represent your family's interests, have debated and voted, but the final decision belongs to you, the citizens of Rome. We are asking you to choose, freely and openly, what kind of government you want, not what the Senate wants, not what I want, what you want. He paused, letting this sink in. The idea that ordinary citizens could actually choose their form of government, that their voice mattered more than tradition or divine right or the preferences of the powerful, this was genuinely radical. Most cities in the ancient world were ruled by kings or tyrants or aristocratic councils that owed no accountability to the common people. The idea that the people themselves could decide was almost unprecedented. When Brutus finished his explanation, he asked the crucial question, his voice ringing across the forum. Do you, the citizens of Rome, approve this system? Do you consent to be governed by elected consuls rather than by kings? Do you choose to live as free men under law rather than as subjects under a monarch's will? There was a moment of silence as the weight of the question settled over the assembly. This wasn't just a vote about administrative structure. This was a vote about what it meant to be Roman, about what kind of people they wanted to be, about whether they had the courage to try something new or would retreat to the familiar safety of monarchy. Then the assembly voted, and here we need to understand how this actually worked. The Curiate Assembly didn't vote as individuals but by curiae. Each of the 30 groups would discuss among themselves, reach a consensus, or at least a majority, and then announce their decision. It was a slower process than simple acclamation, but it was more deliberate, more thoughtful, and it gave every voice a chance to be heard within their family group. The curiae huddled together, and the forum filled with the sound of dozens of simultaneous debates. Arguments for and against, hopes and fears, practical concerns and philosophical principles all being hashed out in urgent whispers and passionate declarations. In one curiate group, an elderly patrician was making his case against the change. We've had kings since Romulus founded this city. The gods chose monarchy for Rome. Who are we to overturn divine will? The gods also gave us minds to think with, a younger member countered. And right now my mind tells me that living under Tarquin was intolerable. If the gods wanted us to keep him, they shouldn't have let him become such a monster. But replacing him with someone better, not abolishing kingship entirely. How do you prevent the next king from becoming another Tarquin? A woman's voice cut in. One of the wives had accompanied her husband and apparently felt entitled to speak her mind. How do you ensure that power doesn't corrupt? At least with consuls who serve for only 1 year, the corruption has limits. In another group, the debate centered on practicality rather than principle. 2 leaders instead of 1 means twice the arguments and half the efficiency. Someone argued, I'll take inefficiency over tyranny, came the response. Tarquin was very efficient at ruining lives. But in war they can appoint a dictator. Brutus explained this. We get decisive leadership when we need it, without being stuck with it forever. One by one the curiae reached their decisions. Some quickly with clear consensus, others after heated debate with narrow majorities. But gradually the voting began. The presiding magistrate. Technically this should have been the king, but since there wasn't one anymore, they had appointed one of the senior senators to oversee the procedure, called out each curia in turn. Curia Aculea. How do you vote? We approve the Republic, came the answer. Curia Calabra? We approve. Curia Fulcia? We approve. Group after group gave their assent. Not unanimously. There were a few curiae that abstained, uncomfortable with such a radical change, but unwilling to explicitly vote against it. 1 or 2 voted against, their representatives arguing that Rome needed time to consider this more carefully, that such a fundamental change shouldn't be rushed. But overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. Yes to the Republic. Yes to elected consuls. yes to limited terms and divided power, yes to trying something new, rather than returning to what had failed them. When the count was complete, when the presiding magistrate announced that a clear majority of the curiae had approved the new system, a cheer went up from the crowd of citizens watching. It started somewhere in the back, and rolled forward like a wave, building in volume and enthusiasm, until the very stones of the forum seemed to vibrate with the sound. Rome would be a republic. The citizens had chosen it freely, had given their consent to this new experiment in self-government. It had the legitimacy not just of revolutionary enthusiasm, but of formal approval through Rome's traditional institutions. Brutus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. They had done it. The first and most important step was complete. Rome had chosen freedom, but there was still more to do. The structure was approved, but they needed leaders. The system was agreed upon, but it needed people to operate it. Next came the question of who would serve as the first consuls. Again, this was somewhat theatrical. Everyone knew the answer would be Brutus and Collatinus, but the form mattered. The assembly needed to elect them, not simply acclaim them, to establish the precedent that consuls derived their authority from the people's choice, rather than from their own actions or revolutionary credentials. The presiding magistrate called for nominations. Brutus and Collatinus were proposed immediately, which was expected. But interestingly, a few other names were put forward as well. Publius Valerius, who had supported the revolution from the start. Marcus Horatius, the military hero. Even Spurius Lucretius, though he immediately declined, saying his grief made him unfit for leadership at this time. It was good, actually, that there were other options. It made the election feel less predetermined, more like an actual choice. The curiae discussed the candidates, weighed their merits, considered who would best serve Rome in this critical first year. When the vote came, it was decisive. Brutus and Collatinus won overwhelming support. They were the men who had led the revolution, who had risked everything to overthrow tyranny, who had sworn over Lucretia's body to free Rome from the Tarquins. Who better to establish the Republic and show that it could work? Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the presiding magistrate announced, are elected as the first consuls of the Roman Republic to serve from this day for 1 year, with equal authority and shared responsibility for the government and defence of Rome. More cheering, though more restrained this time. The gravity of the moment was sinking in. These men now bore responsibility for making this experiment work, for proving that Rome could govern itself without a king. If they failed, if the Republic collapsed into chaos or tyranny or foreign conquest, it would vindicate every skeptic who had said this was madness. But there was one more crucial piece of business, one more act that would define the new Republic's character and bind the people to it. Brutus raised his hand for silence, and when the crowd quieted, he spoke with a gravity that made everyone understand this was important. "Before we take office," Brutus said, "before we assume any authority over our fellow citizens, we must all take an oath. Not an oath of loyalty to us as consuls, we are not kings requiring your submission, but an oath of loyalty to the Republic itself, to the principle that Rome will never again submit to monarchy." He drew his sword, not to threaten, but as part of the ritual, and held it high so the sun glinted off the bronze blade. The gesture was calculated to invoke religious solemnity, to make this feel like a sacred moment rather than just a political one. "I swear by Jupiter Optimus Maximus," Brutus's voice rang out across the forum, "by Mars the god of war, by all the gods who protect Rome, that I will never permit any man to reign as king in this city. If any person seeks to make himself king, I will oppose him with all my strength, with my voice, with my vote, and if necessary, with my sword. I swear that the Republic will endure, that the people will remain free, that no tyrant will ever again rule Rome. May the gods witness this oath, and may they strike me down if I break it." The oath was binding in a way that modern people might struggle to understand. To a Roman, swearing by the gods was not a mere formality or a quaint tradition. It was calling down divine witness to your words, inviting divine punishment if you proved false. Breaking such an oath was not just dishonourable, it was impious, sacrilegious, an offence against the gods themselves. Collatinus repeated the oath next, his voice strong despite the grief he still carried for his murdered wife. Then Valerius, then Lucretius, though his voice broke slightly as he spoke the words. Then the senators who had committed themselves to the Republic. And then, in a remarkable moment, the oath spread to the people themselves. One by one, then in groups, then in a great chorus, ordinary Romans began repeating the words, swearing by the gods that they would never accept a king, that they would defend the Republic with their lives if necessary. It was improvised, unplanned, Brutus hadn't expected this level of participation, but it was powerful. Thousands of voices raised in oath, binding themselves and their descendants to the principle of republican liberty, making this not just a political change but a sacred commitment, something that transcended individual preference and became part of Roman identity itself. When the last voice had fallen silent, when the oath had been sworn and witnessed by gods and men alike, there was a moment of profound quiet in the forum. Romans looked at each other with a mixture of pride and fear and wonder, realizing what they had just done, what they had just committed themselves to. They had not just changed their government, they had changed what it meant to be Roman. From this day forward, a Roman was someone who rejected monarchy, who valued liberty, who believed that free men should govern themselves rather than submit to a king's will. It was a new identity, forged in the aftermath of tyranny, and sealed with sacred oaths. Brutus lowered his sword, feeling the weight of what had just happened. There was no going back now. The oath had been sworn, the Republic had been proclaimed, the gods had been called to witness. For better or worse, Rome's future as a free state was decided. "We begin our work today," he said simply. "May the gods guide us, may wisdom counsel us, and may we prove worthy of the freedom we have claimed." The assembly began to disperse, curiae breaking up into smaller groups, people heading back to their shops and homes and farms, carrying with them the knowledge that they had witnessed history, that they had participated in something unprecedented, that their world had changed in fundamental ways. Brutus and Collatinus remained on the rostra, accepting congratulations from well-wishers, discussing immediate practical matters with senators who had questions about how to proceed. There was so much to do, so many decisions to make, so many precedents to establish. But for just a moment, Brutus allowed himself to simply stand there and look out over the forum, over this city that had chosen freedom, over these people who had sworn to defend it. 2 days ago, he had been playing the fool, pretending to be stupid to survive under a tyrant. Yesterday, he had led a revolution. Today he was consul of a republic that had never existed before. History, he reflected, had a way of moving faster than anyone expected. The first crisis of the new republic came approximately 6 hours after its founding, which must be some kind of record for the rapid transition from idealistic optimism to harsh practical reality. It started, as so many crises do, with a question that seemed simple on the surface, but turned out to be remarkably complicated when you actually tried to answer it. "Who?" asked a merchant named Gaius Publicus, standing in what had been the royal treasury, and was now presumably the republican treasury, "has the authority to release funds for public works?" The clerk he was addressing, a freedman who had managed the treasury's records for years, looked at him blankly. "The king does, or rather, the king did. I suppose now it would be." He paused, genuinely uncertain. "The consuls, both of them, either of them, the Senate. I need to pay the workers finishing the sewer extension in the Subura," Publius explained. "The project was authorized by Tarquin before he was expelled. I've done the work, the workers need to be paid, and I need authorization to draw funds from the treasury. So who do I ask?" "I have absolutely no idea," the clerk admitted. "The procedures for a king releasing funds are very clear. The procedures for consuls doing it don't exist yet because there weren't any consuls until this morning." Publius stared at him. "So what do I do?" "I suppose you could go ask the consuls to create a procedure. Both of them, or just one. I don't know. This conversation, or variations of it, was happening throughout Rome that first day. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy and established a new system, but it hadn't actually created the thousands of practical procedures needed to make that system function. Every transaction that had previously required royal approval now required what? Consular approval? Senate approval. How many people needed to sign off on a given decision? What happened if the two consuls disagreed? Could one consul act alone, or did they always need to act together? These weren't abstract theoretical questions. They were urgent practical matters that needed answers immediately, because Rome couldn't just stop functioning while it figured out its new government. Brutus and Collatinus discovered this very quickly. They had set up a temporary working space in the Curia, since the royal palace felt inappropriate for consuls who were supposed to serve the Republic rather than rule it. They had been there perhaps an hour trying to organize their thoughts about what needed to be done first when the first petitioners arrived. "Consuls," said a harried-looking man who turned out to be the supervisor of Rome's grain supply. "I need authorization to purchase grain from the Latin cities. We normally do this through the king's office, but obviously," he gestured vaguely, indicating the absence of kings. "How much grain?" Collatinus asked. 6,000 modii, to maintain the reserve." "That seems reasonable. Brutus said. Authorized? Authorized by both of you? Or just by Consul Brutus? Brutus and Collatinus looked at each other. Good question, actually. Both of us, Brutus decided. Major expenditures should require agreement from both consuls. Collatinus? Agreed. Collatinus said. Authorized. The grain supervisor looked relieved and started to leave, then paused. Should I get that in writing? And if so, what form should it take? Previously, the king would seal documents with his signet ring, but you don't have a royal seal, and there are two of you anyway. We'll create consular seals, Brutus said, making this up as he went along. In the meantime, our signatures will suffice. Both signatures on major expenditures, either one on routine matters. What counts as major versus routine? Anything over, Brutus hesitated, picking a number essentially at random. 1,000 bronze asses is major. Under that is routine. Should we write this down as policy? Yes, probably. Someone should write this down. The grain supervisor departed, somewhat reassured, and immediately another petitioner took his place. Then another, then several simultaneously, all with urgent questions that needed immediate answers. How should legal disputes be resolved now that there was no king to render judgment? Could either consul hold court, or did they need to create separate magistrates for that? What about criminal cases versus civil cases? What about appeals? Who commanded the city guard? The consuls jointly? Each consul in alternating weeks? What if there was an emergency and they needed to act quickly? Who had the authority to negotiate with foreign cities? Could one consul make a treaty on his own, or did both need to agree? What about the Senate? Shouldn't they be involved in foreign policy? The questions came faster than Brutus and Collatinus could answer them, and with each answer they gave, they created precedent, established procedure, defined what it meant to be a consul, and how the new government would actually function. This is exhausting, Collatinus muttered during a brief lull between petitioners. How did Tarquin manage all this? He didn't consult anyone, or worry about precedent, Brutus pointed out. He just made decisions and expected everyone to obey. Much faster, if considerably more tyrannical. I'm starting to see the appeal. Don't say that too loudly. We just swore an oath against kingship, but the comment highlighted a genuine challenge. The Republic was designed to prevent tyranny through checks and balances, through requiring consultation and agreement, but that very design made it slower, more cumbersome, more difficult to operate than monarchy had been. Every decision required discussion, required consensus building, required navigating competing interests and opinions. It was, in short, a mess. An important, freedom-preserving mess, but a mess nonetheless. And there were larger problems looming beyond simple administrative confusion. Problems that Brutus had known would come but had hoped they might have more time to prepare for. The first hint came late that afternoon, when a messenger arrived from the Latin city of Gabii, the same city that Tarquin's son Sextus had betrayed years ago through his father's clever deception. The messenger looked nervous, and with good reason. He was bringing news that the new consuls definitely didn't want to hear. The Tarquins have taken refuge in Gabii, the messenger reported, standing before Brutus and Collatinus in the Curia. The former king, his wife Tullia, and his surviving son Sextus, they arrived 2 days ago and have requested asylum. Brutus felt his stomach tighten. He had known the Tarquins would try to return eventually. Expelled kings generally didn't just accept their expulsion and retire quietly to a life of peaceful obscurity, but he had hoped they might flee farther away, might seek refuge in some distant Etruscan city where they would be someone else's problem. Gabii was not distant. Gabii was barely 12 miles from Rome, close enough to serve as a base for plotting and scheming, and potentially even military action. Has Gabii granted them asylum? Collatinus asked. The city council is debating it, the messenger said carefully. There are differing opinions. Some remember how the Tarquins treated Gabii before, how Sextus Tarquinius betrayed the city. They want nothing to do with the family. Others argue that Gabii has no quarrel with Rome's new government, and that offering asylum to legitimate refugees is the civilized thing to do. Legitimate refugees, Brutus repeated, his voice flat. Is that what they're calling themselves? Tarquin claims he was illegally deposed, that he remains the rightful king of Rome, and that his expulsion was the work of a small conspiracy rather than the will of the people. He's lying, Collatinus said bluntly. Collatinus, I'm simply reporting what he's saying, the messenger said quickly, clearly not wanting to be caught in the middle of this. Gabii's council wanted Rome to know the situation, and to hear your response before making their final decision. Brutus thought quickly. This was exactly the kind of situation he had worried about. An external threat requiring immediate decision-making when the government was still figuring out basic procedures. But they couldn't afford to appear weak or indecisive. Not now, not when the Republic was still so fragile. Tell Gabia's council, Brutus said, that Rome considers the Tarquins to be criminals who committed murder to seize power and rape to maintain it. We do not recognize Tarquin's claim to kingship. Any city that shelters him is harboring criminals and will be considered hostile to Rome. It was a strong statement. Perhaps stronger than was entirely wise given that Rome's army was still being reorganized under the new government and wasn't really in a position to threaten anyone. But Brutus was gambling that Gabia would choose not to test whether Rome was bluffing. The messenger bowed and departed to carry this message back to Gabi. When he was gone, Collatinus turned to Brutus with a worried expression. Was threatening them wise? We can't actually enforce that threat right now. Probably not, Brutus admitted. But we can't appear weak either. If the Tarquins think we're too disorganized to respond to threats, they'll be encouraged. If other cities think we're uncertain or divided, they'll take advantage. We need to project confidence even if we don't entirely feel it. So we're bluffing. We're being strategically optimistic about our capabilities. That's a fancy way of saying we're bluffing. Yes, well, diplomacy often is. But Gabi was just the first problem. Over the following days, more news arrived, and none of it was encouraging. Tarquin had sent messages to various Etruscan cities, calling upon old alliances and family connections, asking for support in regaining his throne. Most had politely declined. They had their own problems and weren't particularly interested in fighting Rome on behalf of a deposed tyrant, but some were considering it, weighing whether there might be advantage in supporting Tarquin's restoration. The city of Veii, in particular, seemed interested. Veii was Rome's traditional rival, a powerful Etruscan city that had competed with Rome for control of trade routes and territory for generations. They had fought wars with Rome under Tarquin's rule, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, always seeking advantage. The idea of Rome weakened by political upheaval, distracted by internal reorganization, potentially vulnerable to external pressure. This was appealing to Veii's leaders. They're probing our defences, reported Marcus Horatius, who had taken unofficial responsibility for military matters since the consuls were too busy with administrative chaos to focus on defence. Nothing major yet, just small raids across our border, testing our response time, seeing how quickly we can mobilise under the new system. And how quickly can we mobilise? Brutus asked. Honestly, not very quickly at all, Horatius admitted. The army is confused about who's in charge. Under Tarquin, the king commanded and everyone obeyed. Now we have two consuls who theoretically share command, but practically speaking, soldiers don't know whether they should wait for both consuls to agree on orders, or whether they can follow one consul's commands independently. It's creating hesitation and delay. This was exactly the kind of problem Brutus had worried about. The checks and balances that prevented tyranny also made rapid military response more difficult. In an emergency, when decisions needed to be made immediately, having to achieve consensus between two equal leaders could be genuinely dangerous. We need a clearer command structure, Collatinus said. Perhaps we should alternate: one consul commands the army 1 month, the other the next month. Or one consul handles military matters while the other handles civil administration. That could work, Brutus agreed, though we should consult the Senate on this. Military command is too important to decide just between the two of us. So they convened the Senate, which was itself a learning experience because the procedures for a senatorial meeting under the Republic were different from those under a king. Previously, the king had called meetings when he wanted advice, had controlled the agenda, had the authority to dismiss senators or end discussions whenever he chose. Now the consuls were supposed to consult the Senate, to work with them as partners rather than as subjects. It meant longer meetings, more debate, more divergent opinions that all needed to be heard and considered. It was democratic and inclusive, and frequently frustrating. I propose, announced Senator Titus Larsius during the debate about military command, that we establish a rotating system. Each consul commands for 1 month at a time, alternating throughout the year. This preserves the principle of shared power, while providing clear military authority at any given moment. But what if we're in the middle of a campaign, when the month changes? Someone objected. We can't just switch commanders in the middle of a battle. Then we include a provision that the consul who begins a military campaign retains command until it concludes, even if his month of authority expires. That could be abused. A consul could start a campaign deliberately to extend his authority, Then we require Senate approval for any campaign lasting longer than 1 month. That will slow down military response even more. The debates went on like this for hours. Every solution creating new problems. Every answer raising new questions. But gradually, through patience and compromise and the collective wisdom of men who genuinely wanted to make this work, answers emerged. They established rotating military command, with provisions for Senate oversight of extended campaigns. They created procedures for emergency decision-making, allowing either consul to act independently in immediate crises but requiring joint approval for longer-term commitments. They began drafting a rough framework of laws and procedures that would guide Republican governance. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't be perfect for years, maybe decades, as Rome slowly figured out through trial and error what worked and what didn't. But it was functional enough to move forward, which was all they really needed right now. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans were adapting to the new system in their own ways. Some embraced it enthusiastically, celebrating their newfound freedom and participating eagerly in civic assemblies. Others were more cautious, waiting to see whether this republic experiment would actually work before committing themselves fully. Still others grumbled privately that the old system, whatever its faults, had at least been predictable and efficient. I had a case before the courts yesterday. One merchant complained to another in the forum. Under Tarquin, I could get a judgment in 1 day. Now I have to wait for a praetor to be appointed, and apparently they're still debating what a praetor's authority should be and how they should be selected. Better slow justice than quick tyranny, his companion replied, though he sounded more resigned than enthusiastic. Easy for you to say. You're not the one losing money while waiting for the courts to figure out their procedures. But there were also moments of genuine hope. Moments when Romans saw the possibilities of what they were building. When the Senate debated a proposal and actually changed their minds based on the arguments presented, rather than simply rubber-stamping whatever the king wanted. When ordinary citizens participated in an assembly and their votes actually mattered. When someone could criticize the government without fear of exile or execution. These moments didn't erase the frustrations or solve the practical problems, but they reminded people why they had chosen this path, why the difficulties might be worth enduring. Brutus felt this particularly strongly one evening, about a week into his consulship. He was walking home from yet another exhausting day of crisis management and procedural innovation, when a young man approached him in the street. "Consul Brutus," the young man said, his voice eager. "I just wanted to thank you. My father was executed by Tarquin 3 years ago on false charges, our property confiscated. Under the old system there was nothing we could do, but yesterday I petitioned for the return of our property, and the Senate heard my case fairly and ruled in my favor. That would never have happened under a king." Brutus nodded, tired but moved. "I'm glad justice was served. That's what we're trying to build. A system where justice isn't dependent on royal whim but on law and fairness. It's working," the young man said earnestly. "It's actually working." After he left, Brutus stood in the street for a moment, letting those words sink in. It was working. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not without countless problems and complications, but it was working. Rome was governing itself without a king, and while it was chaotic and difficult, and sometimes seemed impossible, it wasn't collapsing. They were making it work through sheer determination and collective effort, through willingness to compromise and adapt, through commitment to the principle that free men could govern themselves if they were willing to put in the effort. It was exhausting, it was frustrating, and it was, Brutus realized, absolutely worth it. But even as he allowed himself this moment of cautious optimism, messengers were riding toward Rome with news that would test the Republic far more severely than administrative confusion ever could. The Tarquins had found allies willing to fight for their restoration, and those allies were gathering their armies, preparing for war. The Republic's first real crisis was approaching fast, and when it came, it would be written in blood. The news arrived on a cold morning in late autumn, carried by a scout who had ridden through the night and looked like he might fall off his horse from exhaustion at any moment. He was brought directly to the Curia, where Brutus and Collatinus were meeting with several senators to discuss the absolutely riveting topic of tax collection procedures, because someone had to figure out how the Republic would fund itself, even if it was possibly the least inspiring work imaginable. "Consuls," the scout gasped, still breathing hard from his ride. "Tarquinii and Veii are mobilizing. Both cities. Their armies are gathering." The room went silent. This was the nightmare scenario, the one they had all been dreading but hoping might not materialize. 2 powerful Etruscan cities, traditional enemies of Rome, joining forces to support Tarquin's restoration. Not just diplomatic maneuvering or border raids, but actual armies preparing for actual war. How many men? Brutus asked, his voice calm despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Hard to say for certain, but the scouts estimate at least 10,000 from Tarquini, perhaps 8,000 from Veii, plus whatever forces the Tarquins themselves can raise from loyalists and mercenaries. So we're looking at something close to 20,000 men, Collatinus said quietly. Maybe more. How many can we field? Asked Senator Marcus Horatius. With full mobilization, perhaps 12,000, Brutus answered. Maybe 15 if we call up every able-bodied man and pray that the Latin cities stay neutral. The math was not encouraging. Rome had spent the last week figuring out administrative procedures and debating constitutional structures while its enemies had been organizing for war. Now they were facing a larger, better-prepared force with the very real possibility that defeat would mean not just military loss but the restoration of Tarquin and the end of the Republic before it had barely begun. When will they move? Collatinus asked the scout. Unknown, consul. But soon, they're provisioning for a campaign, gathering supplies, days, not weeks. After the scout was dismissed to get food and rest, the senators looked at each other with varying expressions of worry, determination, and poorly concealed fear. This was the moment that would define whether the Republic survived or died in its infancy. We need to mobilize immediately, Brutus said. Every citizen of military age will need to move quickly to have any chance. Where will we meet them? Horatius asked. He had taken unofficial responsibility for military planning, and now that unofficial role was about to become very officially important. Do we defend the city, or march out to meet them? If we defend, they'll besiege us, Collatinus pointed out. And a siege favours the larger force. We'd be trapped while they control the countryside. But if we march out with an inferior force, we risk being destroyed in open battle, another senator objected. At least behind walls we have some advantage. No, Brutus shook his head. Collatinus is right. We can't let them besiege Rome. The Republic is too new, too fragile. If we're locked in the city while Tarquin parades around outside claiming to be the rightful king, it undermines everything we've built. We need to meet them in the field and defeat them decisively, or die trying, someone muttered. Yes, Brutus agreed bluntly, or die trying, but at least we'll die as free men fighting for our freedom, not as subjects cowering behind walls waiting for our king to return. There was a grim silence as the senators absorbed this. Then Publius Valerius spoke up, his voice thoughtful. If we're going to march out to meet them, we need to choose our ground carefully. Find a place where our smaller force can negate their numerical advantage. Forest, maybe, or rough terrain where they can't use their full strength effectively. The Silva Arsia, Horatius suggested immediately. The Arsia forest, northwest of the city. It's between us and the likely route from Veii and Tarquinii. Heavily wooded, difficult terrain. If we can force them to fight there, their numbers matter less. It was good tactical thinking, the kind of practical military wisdom that Rome would need to survive this. The Senate debated the details for another hour, exactly how many men to mobilize, which units to send first, how to organize the supply lines, whether to request help from allied Latin cities, before finally reaching consensus. Rome would march to war. Both consuls would go with the army. They couldn't ask citizens to risk their lives while their leaders stayed safely in the city. The mobilization would begin immediately, and they would make their stand in the Silva Arsia, in the forest where Rome's freedom would be either secured or destroyed. The announcement went out across the city within hours. Every male citizen between the ages of 17 and 45 was to report to the Campus Martius, the field of Mars just outside the city walls where military training and musters took place. They were to bring whatever weapons and armor they possessed. The Republic was calling its first army. The response was remarkable, really. Despite all the uncertainty, despite the administrative chaos of the past week, despite the very real possibility that they were marching to defeat and death, Romans answered the call. They came from their workshops and farms, from their merchant stalls and patrician villas, united by the knowledge that if they didn't fight now, they would spend the rest of their lives as subjects instead of citizens. Though the actual gathering on the Campus Martius was somewhat less inspiring than the idea of it. 12,000 men showing up at roughly the same time, all needing to be organized into centuries and cohorts, all needing to be equipped and provisioned and assigned to units, created a level of chaos that made the administrative confusion of the past week look positively organized by comparison. "You there?" a centurion was shouting at a confused-looking young man. "What's your name?" "Marcus Tullius, sir." "Can you fight?" "I've trained with the sword, sir. My father fought under King Tarquin." "Well, now you'll fight against him." Report to the third cohort. Move. Scenes like this were repeated across the field. Men who had never fought together before being organized into units. Veterans of Tarquin's campaigns trying to remember military protocol while adjusting to the reality that they now served consuls instead of a king. Young men who had barely held a sword looking nervous but determined. Brutus and Collatinus moved through the gathering army, trying to project confidence they didn't entirely feel. They spoke to soldiers, listened to concerns, made decisions about organization and command that would have benefited from weeks of planning that had to be made in hours instead. This is insane. Collatinus muttered to Brutus during a brief moment when they weren't immediately surrounded by people asking questions. We're organizing an army on the fly, marching to fight a superior force, with commanders who've never worked together under this system before. This is how armies get destroyed. Yes, Brutus agreed. But what's the alternative? Submit to Tarquin and pretend the last week never happened? No, of course not. I'm not suggesting surrender. I'm just observing that our chances of success are questionable at best. Then we'll have to make up for poor odds with superior determination. That's not how military mathematics works. I know, Brutus said. But it's all we have, so it will have to do. By late afternoon, something resembling an army had been assembled. 12,000 Roman citizens, armed with spears and swords and shields, organized into rough formations ready to march. Not a professional force. Rome didn't have a professional army yet, but a citizen militia united by belief in what they were defending. Brutus addressed them from a raised platform, his voice carrying across the Campus Martius. Romans, he called out. A week ago we drove out a tyrant. We declared that never again would we submit to kingship. We swore oaths to the gods that we would live free or die free. Now we have the chance to prove we meant those oaths. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Young and old, rich and poor, patrician and plebeian, all unified in this moment by their citizenship and their commitment to defending it. The Tarquins have found allies among the Etruscan cities. They march against us with a larger army, believing that we are weak, that our new republic will crumble at the first test. They think we will be afraid, that we will retreat behind our walls and wait for them to restore monarchy by force. They are wrong. A cheer went up from the assembled soldiers. It started small but built quickly. Thousands of voices joining together in defiant roar. We marched to meet them in the field. Brutus continued when the cheering subsided. We marched to show them that free men defending their freedom are worth more than twice their number of soldiers serving a tyrant. We march to prove that the Roman Republic is not a temporary experiment but a permanent reality. We march to victory, or to death, but we march as free men. More cheering, louder this time. Brutus felt the energy of it, the collective will of 12,000 citizens who had chosen to risk everything for their freedom. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. They marched out that evening, a long column snaking northwest from Rome toward the Silva Arsia. It was not a fast march. Moving 12,000 men with supplies and equipment was never fast, but it was steady, determined. The soldiers sang as they marched, old military songs from campaigns under the kings, though with hastily modified lyrics replacing king with consul in ways that sometimes scanned properly and sometimes didn't. Brutus and Collatinus rode near the front of the column, along with Marcus Horatius and other senior commanders. They had divided the army between them according to the rotating command structure they had established. Brutus would command this month, Collatinus the next, though in practice they consulted on every major decision anyway. Do you think they're really coming? Collatinus asked as they rode. Or could this be misinformation? A way to draw us out while Tarquin tries something else? The scouts' reports were solid, Brutus replied. But even if this is a feint, we have to respond. We can't ignore a potential threat just because it might be deception. True. Though it would be embarrassing to march our entire army out to fight phantoms, I'll take embarrassment over the alternative. They made camp that night in a clearing several miles northwest of Rome, posting sentries in a wide perimeter and trying to maintain some semblance of military discipline, despite the fact that most of these soldiers had never campaigned together before. Fires dotted the camp as men cooked simple meals and talked in low voices about what tomorrow might bring. Brutus couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll in the consul's tent, staring at the canvas above him, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. They were outnumbered. They were inexperienced as a unified force. Their command structure was untested. If the battle went badly, if they were destroyed, Tarquin would march into Rome unopposed, and the Republic would end after barely a week of existence. And yet, somehow, he felt more alive than he had in years. For so long he had played the fool, had hidden his intelligence and his ambition behind a mask of stupidity, had watched Tarquin's crimes and said nothing because speaking up meant death. Now, finally, he could act openly, could fight for something that mattered, could be himself without pretense. If he died tomorrow in the Silva Arsia, at least he would die as himself, as Lucius Junius Brutus the consul, rather than Brutus the fool. That had to count for something. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a mist hanging over the forest ahead. The army broke camp early and continued its march, moving more cautiously now as they entered the wooded terrain where they expected to encounter the enemy. Scouts ranged ahead, reporting back on what they found. The Tarquinian and Veii forces were indeed approaching, moving south along the road from their cities. The scouts estimated they would meet sometime in the late afternoon, probably in the heart of the Silva Arsia, where the forest was thickest. Good, Horatius said when this news was reported. The thick forest neutralizes their numerical advantage. They won't be able to bring their full force to bear at once, assuming we can maintain our formations in the forest, Collatinus pointed out, which is not guaranteed with an army that's barely trained to fight together. Do you have a better plan? No. I'm just maintaining a healthy skepticism about our prospects. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew tense. Every rustling in the undergrowth could be an enemy scout. Every shadow could be hiding an ambush. The soldiers clutched their weapons tighter, their eyes scanning the trees, their bodies taut with nervous energy. And then, in mid-afternoon, the scouts came racing back with urgent news. Contact. Enemy forces spotted ahead, less than a mile. They're deploying for battle. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. Brutus felt his heart rate increase. Felt the familiar mix of fear and determination that came before combat. He had fought in battles before, under Tarquin's command, but never with so much at stake, never defending something he truly believed in, rather than serving a tyrant's ambitions. Deploy the army, he ordered. Battle formation. We'll meet them in the forest clearing ahead. The Roman army shifted from marching column to battle formation with remarkable efficiency, considering the centuries and cohorts moved into position, forming lines between the trees, shields locked together, spears ready. They were not professional soldiers, but they were Romans defending their freedom, and that made them dangerous. From the forest ahead came sounds of movement, the rustling of thousands of men moving through undergrowth, the clink of metal on metal, voices calling orders in the Etruscan language, and then they appeared, emerging from the trees like something out of a nightmare. The combined armies of Tarquinii and Veii, a mass of soldiers that seemed to fill the forest, their armor gleaming even in the filtered light beneath the canopy. They deployed opposite the Roman lines, and Brutus could see his soldiers' confidence waver as they realized just how outnumbered they were. In the center of the enemy formation, mounted on a white horse and wearing royal purple, was Tarquinius Superbus himself. Even from a distance, Brutus could see the rage on the former king's face, the absolute conviction that this throne was his by right and that these rebellious Romans would soon learn the cost of their defiance. Beside Tarquin rode his son Sextus, the rapist whose crime had sparked this entire revolution. The sight of him made Brutus's blood boil. That man should be dead for what he did to Lucretia, not riding proudly into battle as though he had done nothing wrong. Well, Collatinus said quietly, sitting on his horse beside Brutus as they surveyed the enemy formation. This is going to be interesting. That's one word for it. Do you have any inspiring words for the troops? Brutus thought about this. What could he say that would adequately capture the magnitude of this moment? They were about to fight not just for military victory, but for the survival of the Republic, for the principle that free men could govern themselves, for everything they had built in the past week. He rode forward, positioning himself where both armies could see him, and raised his voice to carry across the clearing. Romans, you see before you the forces of tyranny. They come to drag you back into slavery, to restore a king you rejected, to make you subjects again instead of citizens. They believe you are weak, that your love of freedom is less strong than their desire for power. Prove them wrong. It wasn't his best speech. He was tired and anxious, and the words came out less eloquent than he'd hoped. But it resonated with soldiers who understood exactly what was at stake. A roar went up from the Roman lines, defiant and fierce. From the enemy formation, Tarquin responded with his own declaration. Lay down your arms. The former king shouted, You have been deceived by traitors and rebels. I am your rightful king, chosen by the gods to rule Rome. Return to your proper obedience and you will be pardoned. Continue this rebellion and you will be destroyed. The Roman response was not verbal. It was the rhythmic clashing of swords against shields, a deafening sound that echoed through the forest, a sound that said more clearly than words could that Rome would never again bow to kings. Tarquin's face darkened with rage. He turned to his commanders and gave an order that was inaudible at this distance, but whose meaning was clear enough. The enemy army began to advance. Brutus drew his sword, the bronze blade catching what little light filtered through the trees. "For the Republic," he shouted. "For freedom, for Rome." And with that cry, 12,000 Roman citizens surged forward to meet their enemies, to fight for their right to govern themselves, to prove that free men defending their freedom were the equal of any army in the world. The Battle of Silva Arsia had begun. The two forces crashed together like waves meeting in a storm, the sound of it tremendous. Shields splintering, swords clashing, men shouting in fury and fear and determination. The forest clearing became a churning mass of struggling bodies, of desperate combat fought between the trees, of Romans and Etruscans locked in battle for the future of a city. Brutus fought in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling, his shield deflecting blows, his entire being focused on the immediate struggle to survive, and to ensure his soldiers around him survived. This was war not as grand strategy, but as brutal personal combat, as the simple desperate struggle to live through the next minute. And somewhere in that chaos, in that bloody confusion of battle, the fate of the Roman Republic was being decided by men who mostly just wanted to get through this alive and get home to their families. The reality of battle. Brutus discovered within the first 30 seconds of combat was nothing like the heroic stories told about it afterward. The stories spoke of glorious charges and noble single combat, of heroes performing impossible feats and dying beautiful deaths with inspiring final words. The reality was chaos and confusion, was not being able to see more than a few feet in any direction through the press of bodies, was slipping on blood-slicked ground and nearly getting killed because you couldn't keep your footing, was the overwhelming noise that made thinking almost impossible. He had fought in battles before, but never like this. Never with so much depending on the outcome. Never defending something that mattered so deeply. The Roman line held barely. The soldiers locked their shields together and pushed back against the Etruscan advance, feet digging into the forest floor, every man supporting the men beside him. It was the kind of combat where individual skill mattered less than collective determination, where the question wasn't whether you were a great warrior, but whether you could stand your ground when everything in your body was screaming at you to run. "Hold," Brutus shouted, though he could barely hear his own voice over the din. "Hold the line." A Tarquinian soldier broke through the shields to his left. Spear aimed at Brutus's chest. Brutus deflected it with his shield, felt the impact jar his arm, and responded with a sword thrust that caught the man in the throat. The Etruscan fell, blood bubbling from the wound, and Brutus had no time to think about it, no time to process that he had just killed someone, because 3 more enemies were already pushing forward to take the fallen man's place. This was how battles were won or lost in this era. Not through brilliant tactics or clever maneuvers, but through the grim arithmetic of endurance. Which side could maintain formation longest? Which soldiers would break first? Which line would finally buckle under the pressure? The forest terrain helped the Romans. The trees prevented the Etruscans from bringing their superior numbers to bear all at once. They couldn't outflank because the dense undergrowth made movement off the main clearing nearly impossible. They couldn't overwhelm through sheer mass because the narrow space forced them to engage on a front no wider than the Roman line itself. But the Etruscans had advantages too. They were better equipped. Many wore proper bronze armor, where Roman soldiers made do with leather, or even just thick cloth. They had more veterans in their ranks, men who had fought in numerous campaigns and knew how to maintain discipline under pressure. And they were confident, certain that their numerical superiority would eventually tell. Collatinus was fighting 50 feet to Brutus's right, visible in glimpses through the chaos. He was holding his section of the line together through force of will and volume, shouting encouragement to his soldiers while his sword rose and fell in steady rhythm. A natural commander, Brutus thought distantly, the kind of leader men would follow anywhere. Marcus Horatius was further down the line, having taken command of the left flank. Reports filtered back through the chaos. His section was under heavy pressure, the Etruscans concentrating their attack there, trying to roll up the Roman line from the side. "We need to reinforce Horatius," someone shouted. "We have no reserves," Brutus shouted back. "Everyone's committed." It was the fundamental problem of fighting with inferior numbers. The Romans had no depth, no second line to throw in when the first line faltered. They were all in, every soldier engaged, with nothing held back for emergencies. The battle raged for hours, though later no one would be able to say with certainty how long it actually lasted. Time became meaningless in combat, stretched and compressed in ways that made seconds feel like hours, and hours feel like seconds. The sun moved across the sky, though barely any light penetrated the forest canopy. Men fought until their arms felt like lead, then kept fighting because stopping meant dying. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn, not because of any dramatic moment or heroic action, but simply because the Romans wouldn't break. The Etruscans pushed and the Romans held. They pushed harder and the Romans held. They threw everything they had at the Roman line, and still it held. Held through sheer bloody-minded determination, held because these were free men defending their freedom, and that made them willing to endure things that no amount of training or discipline could compel. The Etruscan soldiers, who had expected an easy victory over a disorganized rabble, began to falter. They had been fighting for hours against opponents who should have broken by now but hadn't. Their confidence began to erode, replaced by the creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, they weren't going to win this after all. And that was when Tarquin made a mistake. Seeing his forces begin to waver, seeing the Roman line still unbroken despite hours of assault, he decided to personally enter the battle. He would lead a charge himself, would show his soldiers that victory was within reach, if they just pushed a little harder. It was the kind of dramatic gesture that worked well in the heroic stories. In reality, it was a terrible tactical decision. Kings, or former kings anyway, were supposed to command from behind the lines where they could see the entire battlefield and make strategic decisions. Throwing yourself into the melee might inspire your troops, but it also meant you lost any ability to actually command them. Tarquin spurred his white horse forward, surrounded by his personal guard, driving toward the center of the Roman line where Brutus fought. His presence did inspire the Etruscan soldiers. They surged forward with renewed energy, trying to support their king's charge. Brutus saw him coming. Through the press of battle, through the chaos and confusion, he saw Tarquin on his white horse, saw the man who had murdered his father and brother, saw the tyrant who had ruled Rome through fear and cruelty, saw the symbol of everything the revolution had been fighting against. Something primal and furious rose in Brutus's chest. This was personal now. Not just a battle for Rome, but a confrontation between the man who had destroyed his family and the man who had avenged them. He pushed forward through the Roman line, soldiers parting to let him through, making directly for Tarquin. They met in a small clearing between the lines, a momentary gap in the battle where these two men could face each other without immediate interference. Tarquin on his horse, Brutus on foot. King versus consul, tyranny versus freedom. Brutus, Tarquin said, his voice dripping with contempt. The fool who thought he could overthrow a king. I didn't overthrow a king, Brutus replied, his sword ready. I expelled a tyrant. There's a difference. There's no difference, Tarquin snarled. Power is power. Authority is authority. Call it what you want. I am still the rightful ruler of Rome, and you are still a traitor who will die for his presumption. Then come down off that horse and prove it. Tarquin urged his mount forward, drawing his sword, clearly intending to use the height advantage of horseback to strike down at Brutus. But fighting from horseback in dense forest against a skilled opponent on foot was harder than it looked. Brutus dodged the first strike, moved inside the horse's reach, and drove his sword up toward Tarquin. The blade caught the former king in the side, sliding between the armor plates, finding flesh. Tarquin gasped in pain and rage, blood spreading across his royal purple cloak. He swung wildly at Brutus, more in fury than in any tactical sense, the blow glancing off Brutus's shield. They fought like that for several more exchanges. Tarquin trying to use his reach advantage, Brutus trying to stay close where the horse couldn't help his opponent. Blood flowed from wounds on both men now. Tarquin's side was still bleeding, but Brutus had taken a cut across his shoulder that was painful even if not immediately dangerous. And then, with a move that was more luck than skill, Brutus managed to thrust his sword up into Tarquin's chest, piercing the lung. The former king's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He tried to say something, some final defiant words perhaps, or a curse, but all that came out was blood. Tarquin Superbus, the last king of Rome, slid from his horse and fell to the forest floor, his blood soaking into the soil of the land he had once ruled. He died there in the clearing, not in his palace surrounded by family, not in his bed as an old man, but on a battlefield far from Rome, killed by the man he had dismissed as a fool. Brutus stood over the body for a moment, breathing hard, hardly able to believe what had just happened. He had killed the tyrant. Tarquin was dead. The revolution was validated in the most visceral way possible, but the battle wasn't over. Tarquin's death sent shockwaves through both armies. The Etruscans, seeing their royal patron fall, wavered. Some began to pull back. their commitment to this cause suddenly questionable now that the man who had promised them rewards was dead. But others, particularly Tarquin's personal guard and the soldiers from Veii who had their own reasons for fighting Rome, pushed forward with renewed fury, determined to avenge the fallen king. It was one of these soldiers, an officer in Tarquin's guard named Arruns, ironically the same name as one of Tarquin's dead sons, who saw what Brutus had done and made it his personal mission to kill the consul who had killed his king. Arruns charged through the battle line, his face a mask of grief and rage, heading straight for Brutus. The consul was still standing over Tarquin's body, still processing what had happened, when Arruns' spear drove into his chest with terrible force. Brutus looked down at the spear protruding from his body, at the blood spreading across his toga, and felt a strange sense of detachment. So this was how it ended. Not in glory and triumph, but in the chaos of battle, killed moments after his greatest victory. He fell to his knees, and Arruns stood over him, pulling back for a second strike. But before he could deliver it, a dozen Roman soldiers swarmed the Etruscan officer, cutting him down in a fury of blades. Arruns fell beside Brutus, his revenge completed, but his own life ended in the same moment. Collatinus fought his way to where Brutus had fallen, horror on his face as he saw his co-consul, his friend, bleeding out on the forest floor. He knelt beside Brutus, cradling his head. "Lucius," Collatinus said, his voice breaking. "Hold on, we'll get you back to camp. Get the surgeons." "No," Brutus said, his voice weak but clear. "No time for that. The battle. How goes it?" "We're winning. Tarquin's death has broken them. They're starting to retreat." A ghost of a smile crossed Brutus's face. "Good. That's good. The Republic will survive," Collatinus assured him. "You made sure of that. You killed Tarquin. You saved Rome." "We saved Rome," Brutus corrected him. "All of us. Every Roman who chose freedom. That's what matters. Not me. The Republic must continue. Promise me." "I promise," Collatinus said, tears running down his face now. "I swear it." Brutus's eyes were losing focus, his breathing becoming shallow. "Tell the people. Tell them it was worth it. Tell them freedom is always worth the price." And with that, Lucius Junius Brutus, the first consul of the Roman Republic, the man who had overthrown a tyrant and established a new form of government, died in a forest clearing surrounded by the bodies of enemies and friends alike. He had lived 40 years, give or take, and in the last week of his life had changed the course of history. The battle didn't end immediately with Brutus's death. Battles rarely do, momentum and inertia carrying them forward even after crucial moments. But the Etruscans were breaking now, their will shattered by Tarquin's death and the Romans' inexplicable refusal to be defeated. The soldiers from Tarquinii began a fighting retreat back toward their city, and the Veientines, seeing their allies withdrawing, followed suit. The Romans pursued for a short distance, but Collatinus called them back. They had won the victory they needed. Chasing a retreating enemy into unfamiliar territory with an exhausted army would be foolish, and Collatinus had just promised a dying man that the Republic would continue. That meant preserving their forces, not throwing them away in pursuit of a more complete but riskier victory. As the sun began to set over the Silva Arsia, casting long shadows through the trees, the Romans controlled the battlefield. It was a scene of carnage, hundreds of dead from both sides, the wounded crying out for help, the ground soaked with blood. The Romans moved through the aftermath, tending to their wounded, counting their dead, trying to process what they had just experienced. Publius Valerius found Collatinus still kneeling beside Brutus's body, the dead consul's blood staining his hands and tunic. Valerius had tears on his own face. Brutus had been his friend too, the man who had led them all to freedom. The tally is being compiled. Valerius reported quietly. "We lost perhaps 3,000 men. The Etruscans lost more, maybe 5,000. And Tarquin is dead. So is Brutus," Collatinus said, his voice hollow. "I know. I saw. He died a hero's death, Collatinus. He saved the Republic. He deserved to live to see what he built," Collatinus said bitterly. "He deserved to watch Rome flourish as a free city, not to die in the mud after a week as consul." "Perhaps," Valerius said gently. "But he got to die knowing he had succeeded, knowing that Rome would remain free. That's more than most men get." Collatinus looked down at Brutus's face, peaceful now in death despite the violence of how he had died. He thought about the man who had pretended to be a fool for years to survive, who had sworn an oath over Lucretia's body, who had designed a government to prevent tyranny, who had led Rome's first army as a free state and given his life to ensure its survival. "We'll bring him home," Collatinus said finally. We'll give him a funeral befitting a founder of the Republic, and then we'll continue the work he started, because that's what he would have wanted. They made a bier for Brutus's body, covering it with a purple-bordered toga, the toga praetexta that consuls wore, the symbol of his office. They did the same for the other prominent Romans who had fallen, Marcus Horatius among them. The ordinary soldiers were buried in mass graves there in the forest, as was the custom after ancient battles. The smell of death and blood and disturbed earth filled the air. That night, the Roman army camped on the battlefield, too exhausted to march anywhere else. Collatinus walked among the soldiers, speaking to them, thanking them, assuring them that their sacrifice had meaning, that they had defended something worth defending. The soldiers responded with a mixture of pride and grief. They had won. They had saved the Republic. But the cost had been high. A third of their force dead or wounded, including the man who had led them to freedom. Victory felt hollow when you looked around at all the friends who weren't coming home. Was it worth it? One young soldier asked Collatinus when the consul stopped to speak with his unit. All these deaths, all this blood, was preserving the Republic really worth it? Collatinus thought about Brutus's last words, about how freedom was always worth the price. He thought about what life had been like under Tarquin, about the fear and oppression and the degradation of human dignity that came with tyranny. He thought about what Rome could become now that it was free to govern itself. Yes, he said finally, it was worth it. I wish we hadn't had to pay such a high price. I wish Brutus and Horatius and all these others could have lived to see the Rome they died for. But yes, freedom is worth fighting for. Freedom is worth dying for. Because without it, we're not really living anyway. The soldier nodded slowly, seeming to take some comfort from this. Collatinus moved on, offering what solace he could to men who had seen and done terrible things in defense of an idea they were still learning to understand. The next morning, the army began its march back to Rome. They moved slowly, carrying their wounded and their dead, a solemn procession through the autumn landscape. Word of the victory had already spread. Scouts had ridden ahead with news, and as they approached the city, Romans began gathering along the route to see their returning army. The greeting was complex, a mixture of celebration and mourning. Rome had won, had defeated the Tarquins and their allies, had proven that the Republic could defend itself. But the cost was visible in every bier carrying a dead soldier, in every wounded man limping along with the column, in the empty place where Brutus should have been riding at the army's head. Collatinus entered Rome at the front of the procession, alone now where there should have been 2 consuls. Behind him came Brutus's bier, carried by 6 soldiers who had fought beside him in the battle. The sight of it silenced the crowd. The first consul, the man who had made the Republic possible, coming home dead after just a week in office. They brought Brutus's body to the Forum, that space where he had sworn his oath over Lucretia, where he had called for revolution, where he had proposed the Republic. They laid him out on the rostra, and the people of Rome came to pay their respects, to see the man who had given his life for their freedom. Spurius Lucretius, Lucretia's father, spoke briefly at the funeral. His voice was heavy with grief. First his daughter, now his friend, both dead as a result of Tarquin's crimes. "My daughter died to expose tyranny," he said. "Brutus died to end it. Both gave their lives so that Rome could be free. We honor them not with grief alone, though we grieve, but by living as free Romans, by preserving what they died to create. That is the memorial they deserve." They buried Brutus with full honors, in a tomb that would be marked and remembered for as long as Rome endured. And then, because the Republic waited for no one, not even to properly mourn its founders, they turned to the practical question of what came next. Rome had 1 consul when it needed 2. The enemy was defeated, but not destroyed. The government was still being improvised day by day, and somewhere in the chaos of victory and grief and exhaustion, they had to figure out how to continue building the Republic that Brutus had died defending. The Roman Republic, having existed for approximately 8 days, and having just fought its first major battle, now faced a constitutional crisis that no one had anticipated when designing the system. They had 2 consuls, as the system required. Then they had 1 dead consul and 1 living consul, which was not what the system required, and now they needed to figure out what to do about it. The problem was that nobody had written down rules for this situation. When Brutus and the Senate had designed the consulship, they had focused on preventing tyranny and establishing checks and balances. They had thought carefully about how to elect consuls, how to divide power between them, how to limit their terms. What they hadn't thought about was what happened if 1 consul died in office. Did the surviving consul serve alone for the remainder of the year? Did they hold an immediate election for a replacement? Could they appoint someone? If so, by what authority? These were not abstract theoretical questions. They needed answers immediately, because Rome could not afford to appear weak or disorganized in the aftermath of its victory. Collatinus convened the Senate, the day after Brutus's funeral. The senators gathered in the Curia, many of them still wearing the signs of mourning for the dead consul, and for their own family members who had fallen in the battle. The mood was somber, exhausted, uncertain. "We must elect a new consul," Collatinus began without preamble. "The Republic requires 2 consuls, and we currently have only 1. We cannot continue in this state." "The question," said Publius Valerius, "is the procedure. How do we elect a replacement? The normal process involves the Curiate Assembly and takes time to organize properly. But we need leadership now, while the victory is fresh and our enemies are in disarray. I propose," Collatinus said, "that we simplify the process for this emergency. Let the Senate nominate candidates, and let the people vote in a special assembly tomorrow. We don't have the luxury of lengthy deliberations." There were murmurs of agreement. Everyone recognized the urgency. But then one of the senators, an older patrician named Gaius Servilius, raised a concern. "Who should we nominate? Normally we would look to experienced magistrates, men who have proven themselves in civic leadership, but we have no magistrates yet except for the consul. We're still inventing the government as we go. We have military commanders, Marcus Horatius's brother, also named Marcus Horatius because Romans were not creative with names, pointed out, men who led in the battle, who have the soldiers' respect. We have senators who have shown wisdom in debate," another added. "Men who understand governance even if they haven't held formal office." The debate continued for some time, with various names being suggested and discussed. Some advocated for military heroes, others argued for political experience. Still others thought they needed someone who could unite the different factions that were already beginning to emerge in Rome's political life. Finally, Publius Valerius stood. He had been quiet until now, listening to the debate, but when he spoke, the Senate quieted to hear him. "I propose we elect someone who has been part of this revolution from the beginning," Valerius said. "Someone who stood with Brutus when he swore his oath over Lucretia, who supported the expulsion of the Tarquins, who fought in the Battle of Silva Arsia. Someone who understands what we're trying to build here and is committed to the Republic's principles." "That describes several people," someone pointed out, "including yourself." "Yes," Valerius admitted. "It does, and I would be honored to serve if the people choose me. But I'm not advocating for myself specifically. I'm advocating for the principle we need a consul who is genuinely committed to republican government, not someone who might secretly wish for a return to monarchy." It was a pointed comment, and it highlighted a real concern. Not everyone in Rome was entirely comfortable with the Republic. Some patricians missed the predictability of monarchy, where social hierarchies had been clear and their privileges secure. There were whispers that some senators might prefer a king if it were the right kind of king, someone more moderate than Tarquin. "We need to be careful," Valerius continued, "that in our haste to fill the consulship, we don't accidentally elect someone who will undermine what Brutus died defending." The Senate debated for another hour before finally reaching consensus. They would nominate Publius Valerius himself, along with 2 other candidates, Spurius Lucretius, Lucretia's father, and Titus Larsius, a military commander who had distinguished himself in the battle. The special assembly was held the next day. Romans gathered in the forum, tired but determined to participate in this crucial decision. The 3 candidates spoke briefly about their qualifications and their vision for Rome's future. Spurius Lucretius, speaking first, was eloquent but clearly still deep in grief. "I have lost my daughter and my closest friend to Tarquin's tyranny," he said. "I would serve the Republic gladly, but I must be honest with you. My heart is too heavy with grief to carry the burden of leadership effectively right now. I withdraw my name from consideration and ask that you choose between the other candidates." It was a remarkable moment of self-awareness and honesty. Lucretius recognized that being consul required more than just qualifications. It required the emotional and mental capacity to handle the enormous stress of the position, and he was honest enough to admit he didn't have that capacity right now. Titus Larsius spoke next, emphasizing his military experience and his commitment to defending Rome against its enemies. He was competent, respected, and would probably have made a decent consul, but he lacked something intangible, that spark of genuine passion for the republican ideal that had animated Brutus. Then Valerius spoke. He didn't give a long speech or make grand promises. Instead, he talked about practical matters, the work still to be done in establishing the Republic, the reforms needed to make the government more transparent and accountable, the importance of ensuring that Rome's freedom was not just proclaimed but protected through good laws and strong institutions. Brutus gave his life for this republic, Valerius concluded. The least we can do is give our effort to making it work. If you elect me consul, I will spend every day of my term working to build a government that serves you the people, rather than demanding you serve it. That is what Brutus wanted. That is what I want. That is what Rome deserves. The vote was decisive. Publius Valerius was elected consul by a clear majority, with Titus Larsius receiving respectable support but not enough to win. Valerius took the oath of office that same day, swearing by the gods that he would serve Rome faithfully and never permit any man to become king, and then he got to work. Valerius was a different kind of leader than Brutus had been. Where Brutus had been passionate and revolutionary, driven by personal grievance and philosophical conviction, Valerius was more practical and systematic. He understood that the Republic needed not just inspiring principles but functioning institutions, not just freedom from tyranny but freedom to prosper. His first act as consul was to address a concern that had been growing among ordinary Romans. The two consuls lived in the Curia during their terms, using it as both office and residence. But before the consulship was established, when they were still planning the revolution, Valerius had built himself a house on the Velia, one of Rome's hills, overlooking the Forum. It was a large house, impressive and well-positioned, the kind of residence that a wealthy patrician could afford. And some Romans had begun to whisper that Valerius had built his house there so he could look down on the Forum, could literally look down on the people of Rome from his elevated position. The symbolism was troubling. A consul who literally placed himself above the citizens he was supposed to serve. Whether these concerns were fair or not, Valerius had started building the house before anyone had conceived of the Republic. So it's hard to argue he had tyrannical intentions. They were real concerns that threatened to undermine trust in the new government. And Valerius, understanding this, made a dramatic gesture. He ordered the house demolished. It wasn't strictly necessary. He could have simply promised not to live there, could have sold it or converted it to some public use. But Valerius understood the power of symbolism, understood that dramatic gestures sometimes mattered more than practical considerations. So he had his expensive house torn down, stone by stone, and the materials donated for public works. The message was clear. Consuls served the people, not above them. They were citizens holding temporary office, not aristocrats claiming permanent superiority. The house looking down on the Forum was incompatible with republican values, so it had to go. Romans loved it. Here was a consul who took republican principles so seriously that he was willing to destroy his own property to uphold them. Overnight, Valerius's reputation went from that patrician who might have ambitions to the people's consul, a leader genuinely committed to democratic values. In fact, he gained a nickname from this and other populist actions: Publicola, friend of the people. Publius Valerius Publicola. The name stuck, and history would remember him by it. But Publicola didn't stop with symbolic gestures. He understood that the Republic needed actual reforms, concrete changes to how government operated, if it was going to survive and flourish. And so, working with Collatinus and the Senate, he began implementing a series of reforms that would shape Roman government for centuries to come. First, he opened up the consulship itself. Previously, only patricians, members of Rome's old aristocratic families, could hold major offices. Publicola proposed that any Roman citizen, patrician or plebeian, should be eligible to serve as consul, provided they were elected by the people. This was genuinely radical. Roman society was deeply hierarchical, with clear distinctions between patricians and plebeians. Suggesting that a common citizen could rise to the highest office in the land was almost shocking. Many patrician senators objected strenuously. The plebeians lack the education and experience to govern effectively, one senator argued. They're farmers and craftsmen, not statesmen. This will lead to incompetent leadership. The plebeians, Publicola responded, are the majority of Rome's citizens. They fight in our armies, pay our taxes, follow our laws. Why should they not have the opportunity to help make those laws? Besides, they'll only be elected if the people choose them. If they're truly unqualified, the voters will recognize that. But this undermines the natural order. The natural order, Publicola interrupted. His voice hard. Gave us Tarquin superbus. Perhaps the natural order needs undermining. It was a powerful argument, and eventually the Senate agreed, though many patricians did so reluctantly, convinced this would lead to disaster. In practice, it would be many years before plebeians actually held the consulship. Tradition and social pressure were powerful forces, but the principle was established. The Republic was open to talent and merit, not restricted by birth. Second, Publicola addressed the issue of public funds. Under the monarchy, the treasury had been essentially the king's personal property, managed according to his whims with no accountability to anyone. This had led to exactly the kind of abuses you'd expect. Money spent on royal luxuries, funds confiscated from citizens on false charges, no clear accounting of where public money went. Publicola proposed creating a new office, quaestors, financial officials who would manage the treasury and maintain clear accounts of all revenues and expenditures. These quaestors would be elected by the people and would report regularly to the Senate on the state of Rome's finances. Everything would be transparent, available for review, accountable. This way, Publicola explained to the Senate, no consul can simply raid the treasury for personal use. No official can hide corruption behind royal prerogative. The people will know where their tax money goes and can hold us accountable if we misuse it. It was the kind of boring, technical reform that didn't inspire passionate speeches or heroic tales. But it was exactly the kind of thing that made the Republic functional rather than just idealistic. Good government required good administration, required systems and procedures and accountability. Publicola understood this in a way that Brutus, for all his passion, might not have. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Publicola proposed legal protections for Roman citizens against government abuse. He introduced the concept of provocation, the right of any citizen to appeal a magistrate's judgment to the People's Assembly. If a consul or other official sentenced you to death or confiscation of property, you could appeal to the Assembly, and they would review the case. No official, Publicola declared, not even a consul, should have the power to execute or exile a citizen without the people's approval. We overthrew a king who had that power. We will not give it to our elected officials. This was revolutionary. It meant that Rome's leaders were not just accountable in theory, but could be checked in practice. That citizens had actual recourse against government abuse, not just the hope that their leaders would be virtuous. It transformed the relationship between government and governed, making the people not just voters but active participants in justice. These reforms, proposed over the course of several weeks in late 5009 BC, fundamentally reshaped Roman government. They transformed the Republic from an emergency response to tyranny into a functioning system with institutions and procedures and protections. They were Publicola's gift to Rome, less dramatic than Brutus's sacrifice, but equally important to the Republic's survival. Collatinus supported all these reforms, working alongside Publicola to implement them. But there was a problem with Collatinus, an issue that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. His name was Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. Tarquinius. He bore the name of the royal family, the family Rome had just expelled, the family that had brought tyranny and murder and rape to the city. And while everyone knew that Collatinus had been one of the leaders of the revolution, that his own wife had been Tarquinius' victim, that he had fought against the Tarquins at Silva Arsia, the name itself was becoming a problem. Romans were deeply superstitious about names. They believed names had power, that they could influence events, that certain names carried certain destinies, and having a consul named Tarquinius, even a good and honourable one, was making people uncomfortable. They whisper about it. Publicola told Collatinus during a private conversation one evening, the people worry that having a Tarquinius as consul is a bad omen, that it keeps the connection to monarchy alive. Some even wonder if you might secretly sympathise with your royal relatives. That's absurd, Collatinus said, his voice bitter. I've done nothing but serve the Republic. I led the revolution with Brutus. I fought against Tarquin, and watched my colleague die in that battle. What more do I need to do to prove my loyalty? Nothing, Publicola said gently. No one doubts your loyalty, Collatinus. This isn't about what you've done. It's about perception, about symbolism. The Republic is still so new, still so fragile. We can't afford anything that undermines confidence in our government, even something as silly as a name. Collatinus was silent for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and sad. You're asking me to resign, aren't you? I'm not asking anything, Publicola said. I'm explaining the situation. The decision is yours to make. But yes, I think the Republic would be stronger if you stepped aside. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your name has become an obstacle to building trust. My name, Collatinus repeated, and laughed bitterly. I can't even change my name. It's who I am. It's my family identity. So the only solution is for me to leave office entirely. You could go to Lavinium, Publicola suggested. Live there honourably, respected for your service. No one will think less of you. Everyone will understand that you're sacrificing for the good of Rome. Everyone will understand that I was forced out because I bore the wrong name. Collatinus corrected him. Let's be honest about what this is. Publicola didn't argue. There was nothing to say that would make this less painful or less unfair. Collatinus had been a hero of the revolution, had lost his wife to Tarquin's crimes, had served the Republic faithfully, and now he was being asked to give up his office because his family name made other people uncomfortable. It was unjust. It was also politically necessary. And that combination, injustice in service of necessity, was something Collatinus would have to live with. "I'll resign," Collatinus said finally. "Tomorrow, in the Senate, I'll explain that I'm stepping aside voluntarily for the good of Rome. I won't make this a source of division or controversy. The Republic matters more than my pride. I'm sorry," Publicola said. And he meant it. "You deserved better than this. We all deserve better than this," Collatinus replied. "But we work with what we have." The next day, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus resigned from the consulship and left Rome for Lavinium, where he would live out the rest of his life in quiet dignity. Spurius Lucretius was elected to replace him, having recovered enough from his grief to accept public service. It was a sad ending to the story of one of the Republic's founders, but it demonstrated something important about the new Rome, that the Republic mattered more than any individual, that even heroes and founders could be asked to sacrifice when the common good required it. It was harsh, perhaps, but it was also the kind of principle that would help Rome survive. Meanwhile, on the Capitoline Hill, work continued on the great temple to Jupiter that Tarquin had started, and the Republic had continued. The temple was nearly complete now, its terracotta decorations painted and installed, its cult statue of Jupiter carved and gilded, its massive columns supporting a roof that could be seen from throughout the city. The dedication was scheduled for the Ides of September 13th, 5009 BC. It would be a celebration not just of the temple's completion, but of the Republic's survival, a declaration that Rome under free government could achieve things just as magnificent as Rome under kings. Marcus Horatius Pulvillus, one of the heroes of Silva Arsia, and now elected as consul to replace Collatinus, was given the honor of performing the dedication ceremony. He stood before the temple in his consular toga, surrounded by senators and citizens, his hand on the doorpost, as was traditional for dedication rituals. As he began the formal words of dedication, a messenger arrived with urgent news that seemed designed to interrupt the ceremony and cast doubt on its success. The messenger announced, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that Horatius's brother had just died, and that according to religious law, Horatius was now ritually impure and could not perform the dedication. It was clearly an attempt at sabotage, probably by someone who resented the Republic and wanted to undermine this moment of celebration. But Horatius, demonstrating the kind of determination that had won the Battle of Silva Arsia, simply ignored the messenger and continued with the dedication ceremony, his hand never leaving the doorpost. "The temple is dedicated," he declared, completing the ritual words. "May Jupiter Optimus Maximus accept this house and protect Rome and its people forever." And with that, the temple was consecrated, the first great public work completed by the Republic. It stood on the Capitoline Hill as a testament to what free Rome could achieve, as a symbol of the gods' favor for the new government, as a promise that the Republic would endure. The people cheered, and for the first time in weeks, Romans allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had actually succeeded. The Tarquins were defeated, the Republic had survived its first battles, the government was functioning, and Jupiter himself had a temple that proclaimed Rome's greatness to the world. It had been exactly 1 month since Brutus stood in the Forum with a bloody knife and swore to expel the kings. 1 month of chaos and war and sacrifice and innovation. 1 month that changed Rome forever. The Republic had found its footing. Now it just needed to survive. The months following the dedication of Jupiter's temple should have been a time of relief and celebration for Rome. The Tarquins were defeated, the Republic was functioning, and the gods had clearly shown their favor by accepting the great temple on the Capitoline. Romans should have been able to relax, to enjoy their freedom, to take pride in what they had accomplished. Instead, those months were marked by paranoia, suspicion, and the slow realization that overthrowing a tyrant was easier than building a government that could resist tyranny's return. The problem was simple but profound. Not everyone in Rome actually wanted the Republic to succeed. For some patricians, the old system had been comfortable. They had known how to navigate royal favor, how to maintain their privileges, how to ensure their families' positions. The Republic, with its elections and assemblies and this disturbing talk about plebeians having rights, threatened to upend the social order they had benefited from. And then there were those with more personal reasons for wanting the monarchy restored. People who had been close to Tarquin, who had profited from his regime, who had been promised rewards for their loyalty. Tarquin's death at Silva Arsia had not eliminated these people. It had simply made them more desperate and more dangerous. The conspiracy, when it was discovered, shocked Rome to its core. Not because conspiracies were unusual, plotting was a constant feature of ancient political life, but because of who was involved. It started with a slave named Vindicius, a young man owned by the Aquilius family, one of Rome's most prominent patrician households. Vindicius had the kind of job that made him effectively invisible. He served wine at dinner parties, stood in corners waiting to be summoned, moved through the house attending to various tasks. People spoke freely around him, because slaves in the Roman worldview barely counted as people at all. They were furniture that occasionally needed to be given instructions, which meant Vindicius heard things that troubled him deeply. The Aquilius brothers, Titus and Gaius, were hosting regular gatherings at their house, gatherings that Vindicius served at. The guests were all young patricians, sons of prominent families, men who should have been enthusiastic supporters of the new republic. Instead, they spent these evenings drinking wine and complaining about how much better things had been under the monarchy. "My father had direct access to the king," Titus Aquilius said one evening, his voice bitter with wine and resentment. "Now he has to compete for attention in the Senate like some common citizen. Where's the dignity in that?" "The dignity," another young patrician replied, "is supposed to be in serving the republic. That's what they keep telling us anyway. Serving." Gaius Aquilius spat. "We're patricians. We're supposed to lead, not serve. This republic nonsense has everything backward." Vindicius, standing in the corner with a wine amphora, kept his face carefully neutral. This was dangerous talk, but it was still just talk. Wealthy young men complaining about politics was nothing new. He refilled cups when asked and tried not to draw attention to himself. But then the conversations began to change. Instead of just complaining, the young patricians began discussing alternatives. What if the Tarquins could be brought back? Not Tarquin Superbus himself. He was dead. Sextus is as bad as his father, someone objected. Remember what he did to Lucretia. The people will never accept him. The people, Titus Aquilius said with contempt, will accept what we tell them to accept. We're the patricians, the noble families. If we unite behind Sextus, if we present a united front, the plebeians will fall in line. They always do. Vindicius felt cold fear in his stomach. This wasn't just disgruntled aristocrats complaining anymore. This was conspiracy. Treason. The kind of talk that could get everyone in the room executed. But it got worse. Over the following weeks, the gatherings became more focused, more serious. They began discussing actual plans, how to make contact with Sextus Tarquinius in Gabii, how to coordinate with him, how to organize a coup that would restore the monarchy. "We need to move soon," Gaius Aquilius urged at one meeting. "Before the republic becomes too established, before people get too comfortable with it. Right now, Rome is still adjusting, still uncertain. That's when we strike." "What about the consuls?" someone asked. Publicola and Lucretius both supported the revolution. "They won't simply step aside. Then they'll have to be removed," Titus Aquilius said coldly. "Accidents happen. Political violence is regrettable but sometimes necessary." They were planning to murder the consuls, to kill Publicola, who had demolished his own house to show his commitment to republican values, to kill Lucretius, who had already lost his daughter to Tarquin's crimes, and then to throw open Rome's gates to Sextus Tarquinius, to restore the man whose rape of Lucretia had sparked the entire revolution. Vindicius knew he had to do something. But what? He was a slave. His word meant nothing against that of patricians. If he accused these men and couldn't prove it, he would be executed for false testimony against his masters. Even if he could prove it, speaking against his owner was itself a crime that could get him killed. But if he said nothing, the Republic would fall. The freedom that Romans had fought and died for would be extinguished. Brutus's sacrifice at Silva Arsia would be meaningless. Lucretia's death would be vindicated by the restoration of the very man who had raped her. The decision, when Vindicius finally made it, was not about courage or heroism. It was about the simple calculation that some things mattered more than personal safety. He waited until he had a day off, slaves did occasionally get brief periods of rest, and made his way to Publius Valerius Publicola's residence. Getting an audience with a consul was not easy for a slave. The guards at the door tried to turn him away. The steward asked what business a slave could possibly have with a consul. Vindicius insisted, with increasing desperation, that he had urgent information about a plot against the Republic. Finally, more to get rid of this annoying slave than out of any real belief in his story, someone brought Vindicius before Publicola. The consul was working through a stack of documents, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had been doing the work of building a government from scratch for months now. "Well," Publicola said, not looking up from his reading. "My steward says you claim to know about a plot. Speak quickly, I have work to do." Vindicius took a breath and told him everything. The gatherings at the Aquilius house, the conversations about restoring the monarchy, the plans to murder the consuls, the communications with Sextus Tarquinius. He spoke rapidly, urgently, knowing he had one chance to be believed. When he finished, Publicola was staring at him intently. "The documents forgot. These are serious accusations," the consul said carefully. "You understand that if you're lying, you'll be executed?" "I understand, consul. I'm not lying. Can you prove any of this?" "The Aquilius brothers have been receiving letters from Gabii, from Sextus Tarquinius. They keep them in a locked box in their father's study. I've seen them taking letters in and out." "You've seen the letters themselves?" "Well then, these?" "No, consul. I can't read, but I know where they're kept." Publicola was silent for a long moment, weighing this. The slave's testimony was unreliable by definition. Slaves could be tortured to make them say anything, which paradoxically made their voluntary testimony almost worthless in Roman law. But Vindicius seemed genuinely frightened, and his story had the ring of truth. "If I investigate this and find nothing," Publicola said, "you will be returned to your master and punished for making false accusations. Do you understand?" "I understand. Please, consul, you must believe me. They're planning to act soon." Publicola made his decision. "I'll investigate. Stay here. You're under my protection now, for what that's worth." That night, Publicola and his brother Marcus, along with a group of trusted men, went to the Aquilius house. They brought with them the other consul, Spurius Lucretius, and several senators who could serve as witnesses to whatever they found. The Aquilius family was not expecting visitors. When Publicola and his men arrived at the door, accompanied by armed guards, the elderly Aquilius father tried to bluster, demanding to know what authority the consuls had to intrude on a patrician household. "The authority of the Republic," Publicola said coldly. "We're investigating reports of a conspiracy. We'll be searching your house. You can cooperate, or you can be arrested for obstruction. Choose quickly." The Aquilius brothers, Titus and Gaius, were in the atrium with several other young patricians. They went pale when they saw the consuls and the guards. One of them tried to run, but the guards caught him before he reached the door. "Where are the letters?" Publicola demanded. "What letters?" Titus Aquilius said, but his voice lacked conviction. Vindicius, who had accompanied them and now stood nervously behind the consuls, pointed to the study. "There, consul, in the locked box on the shelf." They found the box exactly where Vindicius had said it would be. The lock was broken open, patricians protesting that this was a violation of their property rights, and inside were dozens of letters written in Etruscan, bearing Sextus Tarquinius's seal, detailing plans for a coordinated uprising to restore the monarchy. The letters were damning. They outlined exactly what Vindicius had described: plans to assassinate the consuls, to seize key positions in the city, to open the gates to forces loyal to Sextus. They named names, listed conspirators, provided details that left no doubt about the plot's existence and scope. Publicola read through them with growing horror. These weren't just a few disgruntled young men fantasizing about the old days. This was an organized conspiracy involving prominent families, with genuine plans to overthrow the Republic through violence. "Arrest them all," Publicola ordered. "Everyone named in these letters. We'll hold trials publicly in the Forum, so all of Rome can see that justice is done." The arrests happened that night, and continued through the next day. Prominent young patricians were taken from their homes, their fathers protesting furiously that this was an outrage, a violation of patrician dignity, an abuse of consular power. But the letters were irrefutable evidence, and even the most ardent defenders of patrician privilege had to admit that conspiracy to murder the consuls and restore tyranny was probably worth investigating. The trials were held in the Forum, in full view of the assembled Roman people. The letters were read aloud, the conspiracy detailed, the accused given a chance to defend themselves. But what defense could they offer? The evidence was overwhelming, written in their own hands or at least in correspondence they had received and kept. What shocked Romans most was not the conspiracy itself. Conspiracies were depressingly common, but the youth and prominence of those involved. These were sons of the best families, young men who had everything to gain from the Republic if they would only be patient and work within the system. Instead, they had chosen treason, had plotted to destroy Rome's freedom because they missed the privileges of monarchy. Did you learn nothing from Silva Arsia? Spurius Lucretius asked the accused during the trial, his voice heavy with grief and anger. Did my daughter's death mean nothing? Did Brutus's sacrifice mean nothing? You would throw away everything they died for because you want to feel special, because you miss having direct access to power? Titus Aquilius tried to justify himself. The Republic is chaos. Rome needs strong leadership, clear hierarchy, not this constant debate and voting and... The Republic is freedom, Lucretius interrupted. It may be messy, but it's freedom, and apparently that's less appealing to you than the comfortable slavery of knowing your place in a tyrant's court. The people of Rome, watching from the crowd, made their feelings clear. There were calls for execution, for severe punishment, for making an example that would discourage any future conspirators. The young patricians had plotted against the freedom that ordinary Romans had fought to win, and ordinary Romans were not inclined to be merciful. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of treason against the Republic. The sentence was death. The executions were carried out publicly, in the Forum, with the full solemnity that Roman justice demanded. The condemned men were stripped and bound to posts, then beaten with rods by the lictors before being beheaded with axes. It was brutal, deliberately so, meant to serve as a warning. Spurius Lucretius, as consul, presided over the executions. He watched with a face like stone as the sons of Rome's best families died for their treason. There was no pleasure in it, no satisfaction, just the grim necessity of showing that the Republic would defend itself, that betrayal would be punished regardless of birth or status. The father of the Aquilius brothers tried to plead for mercy, tried to argue that they were young and foolish, that they deserved a second chance. Lucretius listened, then shook his head. My daughter deserved a second chance, he said quietly. She deserved to live. She died because of what Sextus Tarquinius did to her, and your sons were trying to bring him back to power. There is no mercy for treason, no second chances for those who would destroy what so many died to create. The axes fell. The conspirators died, and Rome learned a harsh lesson about the price of betrayal. Vindicius, the slave whose testimony had exposed the conspiracy, was granted an extraordinary reward. He was given his freedom, manumission, release from slavery. More than that, he was granted citizenship, becoming a full Roman citizen with all the rights and privileges that entailed. It was unprecedented, a slave becoming a citizen. But the Republic needed to send a message that loyalty to Rome mattered more than social status, that those who defended the Republic would be rewarded regardless of their birth. You saved Rome, Publicola told Vindicius at the ceremony granting his freedom. You risked your life to expose a conspiracy that could have destroyed everything we've built. You are more deserving of citizenship than any of the traitors who were born to it. Vindicius, now Publius Vindicius, taking the praetorian mark of his new status, wept openly at the ceremony. He had gone from being property to being a citizen, from being invisible to being a hero, from having no rights to having all the rights of a free Roman. It was a powerful symbol of what the Republic could be, a place where virtue and loyalty mattered more than birth, where even a slave could become a citizen if he served Rome faithfully. The reality would often fall short of this ideal, as realities tend to do, but the principle was established, and that mattered. The conspiracy's exposure and harsh punishment had several important effects on the young Republic. First, it made clear that treason would not be tolerated, that the Republic would defend itself ruthlessly against internal threats. Second, it demonstrated that patrician status was not a shield against justice, that prominent families could not protect their children from the consequences of betrayal. And third, it showed that the Republic valued loyalty over social status, that service to Rome mattered more than birth. But the conspiracy also revealed something troubling, that support for the Republic was not universal, that there were Romans who genuinely missed the monarchy and would work to restore it. This meant the Republic could not relax, could not assume its survival was assured. It would have to remain vigilant, would have to continually prove itself worthy of support, would have to show Romans that freedom was worth the difficulties it entailed. In Gabia, Sextus Tarquinius received word that his conspiracy had been discovered and his supporters executed. He raged at the news, at this latest failure to reclaim what he saw as his family's rightful position. But there was nothing he could do. His father was dead, his brothers were dead, his Roman supporters were dead or too frightened to help him. Sextus would continue plotting for a few more years, would continue trying to find allies willing to support his restoration. But each attempt would fail, each scheme would collapse, until finally he too would die, killed, according to legend, by men in Gabii, who remembered how he had betrayed their city years ago at his father's command. The Tarquins' time was truly over. The family that had given Rome 2 kings, that had expanded Roman power and built great monuments, that had also brought tyranny and murder and rape, was finished. They would live on only in memory, in cautionary tales, in the name Romans used as the ultimate insult. Calling someone a king would be among the worst things you could say about them for centuries to come. Back in Rome, life continued. The Republic settled into something resembling normalcy, or at least what passed for normalcy, in a government that was still making up its procedures as it went along. Public Sulla and Lucretius completed their year as consuls, established precedents, created institutions, showed Rome that the Republic could function. New consuls were elected for the following year. Publius Valerius Publicola was re-elected, serving with Marcus Horatius Pulvillus, the man who had dedicated Jupiter's temple. The fact that Publicola was re-elected was significant. It showed that good leadership could continue, that Rome didn't have to change consuls just for the sake of change. The Latin cities, which had been watching nervously to see if Rome's republic would survive, began to accept the new reality. Some even started adopting similar reforms in their own governments, inspired by Rome's example. The Republic was becoming not just Rome's internal matter, but a model that others might follow. Trade resumed. Building projects continued. The courts operated. The assemblies met. The Senate debated. All the ordinary business of civic life carried on, which was perhaps the strongest evidence that the Republic was working. Rome was governing itself without a king, and the world had not ended, but there were still challenges ahead. The Etruscan cities, while respectful of Rome's military power after the Battle of Silva Arsia, were not necessarily friendly. Border disputes needed resolution. Trade agreements needed negotiation. Military threats, while diminished, had not disappeared entirely. And internally, the tension between patricians and plebeians, between the old aristocratic families and the common citizens, was already beginning to show. The reforms had given plebeians more rights in theory, but in practice, power still rested largely with the patrician families. This would become a source of conflict in the years ahead, a struggle that would shape Roman politics for generations. But for now, in these early months and years of the Republic, Romans could take satisfaction in what they had accomplished. They had overthrown a tyrant. They had established a new form of government. They had defended it against external attack and internal conspiracy. They had shown that free men could govern themselves without descending into chaos. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was theirs, created by their choice, defended by their sacrifice, improved by their effort. The Roman Republic, born in blood and pain in the year 509 BC, had survived its infancy and was beginning to grow into whatever it would become. As the year 5009 BC drew to a close, as autumn turned toward winter and Romans prepared for the cold months ahead, it became possible for the first time to step back and actually consider what had happened. To look at Rome not as a city in crisis, lurching from one emergency to the next, but as a republic that had somehow, against considerable odds, survived its first year of existence. It had been an extraordinary year by any measure. It had begun with Rome as a monarchy, ruled by Tarquinius Superbus, a king who commanded through fear and maintained power through violence. It would end with Rome as a republic, governed by elected consuls, advised by a senate that had real authority, accountable to citizens who had real rights. The transformation had cost Rome dearly. Lucretia dead by her own hand. Brutus killed at Silva Arsia. Marcus Horatius fallen in the same battle. 3,000 soldiers dead in that single fight. Countless others executed for conspiracy, or killed in the violent aftermath of revolution. The Tarquin family, for all their faults, scattered into exile or dead. An entire system of government overturned and rebuilt from scratch. But Rome endured. More than endured. It had proven something that no one had been entirely certain was provable. That a city could govern itself without a king. That free citizens could create laws and institutions that would protect their freedom rather than undermine it. That democracy, or at least something approaching it, something that would later be called republicanism, could work in practice and not just in theory. Publius Valerius Publicola, as the year wound down, found himself reflecting on this in the quiet moments between endless administrative tasks. He was sitting in the Curia one evening, reviewing proposed legislation for the next Senate meeting, when Spurius Lucretius entered. "Still working?" Lucretius asked, settling onto a bench with the weariness of a man who had carried too much grief for too long. "Always," Publicola replied. "The work never ends." I thought being consul would be about grand decisions and important policies. Instead, it's mostly about making sure the grain supply is adequate and resolving disputes about property boundaries. Boring, but necessary. Exactly. Rome doesn't fail because of grand disasters, at least not usually. It fails because no one bothered to ensure the aqueduct was maintained, or the granaries were properly managed. Glory is in the dramatic moments, but civilization is in the boring details. Lucretius smiled slightly. Brutus would have hated this part. He was good at the dramatic gestures, the inspiring speeches. I'm not sure he would have had the patience for grain management. Perhaps, Publicola said. But he gave us the chance to do this work. He created the space for boring administrative competence to matter. That's worth something. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who had lived through more history in 1 year than most people experienced in a lifetime. Do you think it will last? Lucretius asked finally. The Republic, I mean? Do you think we've actually created something permanent? Or is this just a temporary aberration before someone else becomes king? It was the question everyone was asking, though usually not out loud. Could the Republic endure? Or would it collapse under its own weight? Or be overthrown by someone ambitious enough and clever enough to seize power? I don't know, Publicola admitted. I hope it lasts. I think we've built something worth keeping. But there will always be people who want more power than the system allows, who see the checks and balances as obstacles rather than protections. We'll have to remain vigilant. Eternal vigilance, Lucretius quoted. The price of freedom. Yes. Though I have to say, eternal vigilance is exhausting. They both laughed at that, the kind of tired laughter that comes from surviving something difficult and being able to look back on it from a position of relative safety. My daughter would have liked to see this, Lucretius said after a moment, his voice soft. Lucretia believed in virtue, in honor, in doing what was right even when it was difficult. The Republic, for all its flaws and complications, is built on those principles. She would have approved. She made it possible, Publicola said. Her death, her choice to make her violation public rather than hide it in shame. That sparked everything that followed. Without her courage, we might still be living under Tarquin. Sometimes I wonder if the price was too high, Lucretius admitted. My daughter Brutus, all those soldiers, was freedom worth all those lives? Publicola thought about this carefully. It was not a question to be answered glibly or dismissed with platitudes. I think, he said finally, that freedom is always worth fighting for. But that doesn't make the price any less painful. Your daughter shouldn't have had to die. Brutus shouldn't have had to die. Those soldiers shouldn't have had to die. But given that Tarquin created the circumstances that made their deaths necessary, given that he was the one who violated Lucretia and ruled with such tyranny that revolution became inevitable, yes, I think what we've gained is worth what we've paid. Not because the price was small, but because the alternative was unacceptable. Lucretius nodded slowly. I tell myself something similar. It doesn't make the grief any less, but it makes it bearable, I suppose. Knowing that Lucretia's death meant something, that it changed Rome for the better. More than just changed it, Publicola said. She helped create a new Rome, a free Rome. That's a legacy that will endure for as long as the Republic stands. The conversation moved on to other topics, the practical details of governance that consumed so much of their time. But the question Lucretius had asked lingered in Publicola's mind, long after the other consul had gone home. Would the Republic last? Could it last? The answer, Publicola knew, depended on Romans themselves. The system they had created was sound enough, with its checks and balances, its elections and assemblies, its protection of citizen rights. But any system was only as good as the people operating it. If future Romans valued freedom, if they remained vigilant against tyranny, if they were willing to sacrifice for the common good rather than pursuing only personal ambition, then yes, the Republic could endure. But if Romans became complacent, if they forgot the lessons of Tarquin's tyranny, if they allowed ambition to override civic virtue, then the Republic would fall. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. Systems didn't maintain themselves. They required constant effort, constant renewal, constant commitment from each generation. In the weeks leading up to the end of the consular year, Publicola and Lucretius worked to consolidate the reforms they had implemented, to turn temporary expedients into permanent institutions, to establish precedents that would guide future consuls. They created more detailed procedures for elections. They clarified the Senate's role in foreign policy. They established guidelines for military command during campaigns. It was boring work, the kind of thing that no one would remember or celebrate. But it was essential. Rome needed not just inspiring principles but functioning bureaucracy, not just heroic sacrifices but competent administration, not just freedom from tyranny but freedom to prosper. The elections for the next year's consuls were held in December, and they went smoothly. Publius Valerius Publicola was elected for a second term, or technically a third term, since he had already served twice this year after Brutus's death, and then Collatinus's resignation. His colleague would be Marcus Horatius Pulverus, serving his second term as well. The fact that both consuls were being re-elected was significant. It showed that the Republic valued competence and experience, that Romans were willing to return good leaders to office, rather than demanding constant change just for the sake of change. But it also established that re-election was possible without being automatic, that each consul would have to earn the people's continued trust. On the last day of their term, Publicola and Lucretius stood together in the forum, preparing to hand over authority to the new consuls. It was a moment of ceremony and symbolism, but also of genuine emotion. They had guided Rome through its first year as a republic, had dealt with crisis after crisis, had helped create something that had never quite existed before. "We did it," Lucretius said quietly as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "We actually did it. Rome survived." "Rome more than survived," Publicola replied. "Rome thrived. We're stronger now than we were under Tarquin, more unified, more capable. The Republic works. For now." "For now," Publicola agreed, "but that's all any government can claim, that it works for now. The future will have to take care of itself." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Publicola and Lucretius formally relinquished their authority, symbolically removing the consular insignia. Then the newly elected consuls, Publicola again, along with Horatius, accepted the symbols of office and swore their oaths to serve Rome faithfully and to never permit any man to become king. The crowd cheered, celebrating not just the new consuls but the survival of the Republic itself. 1 year ago, this moment would have been unimaginable. Now it was reality, was precedent, was the beginning of a tradition that would last for centuries. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, an old senator approached Publicola. His name was Gaius Servilius, and he had served in the Senate for decades, had watched Rome under 4 different kings, had seen more history than most people could imagine. "Consul," Servilius said, his voice reedy with age but still sharp. "May I have a moment?" "Of course, Senator. I wanted to tell you something," Servilius said. "I've lived a long time. I've seen kings rise and fall, seen wars won and lost, seen Rome grow from a modest city to a regional power, and I have to tell you, what you and the others have accomplished this year is the most remarkable thing I've witnessed in all that time." "We were fortunate," Publicola said modestly. "We had circumstances that made change possible." "Nonsense," Servilius said bluntly. "Lots of cities have circumstances that make change possible. Very few actually manage to change in ways that improve things rather than making them worse. You created something new, something better. Don't dismiss that as luck." "What do you think will happen?" Publicola asked. "You've seen so much history. Do you think the Republic will last?" Servilius considered this carefully. "I think," he said finally, "that it will last as long as Romans remember why it was created, as long as they remember Lucretius' sacrifice, and Brutus's death, and the Battle of Silva Arsia, as long as they remember that tyranny is always a possibility, and that freedom requires constant defense. When they forget those things, and eventually generations from now they probably will forget, that's when the Republic will be in danger." "Grim prophecy." "Realistic prophecy," Servilius corrected. "Human nature doesn't change. People will always be tempted by power, will always look for shortcuts around the law, will always prefer comfort over vigilance. That's not pessimism, it's observation. The Republic can survive those temptations if Romans remain committed to its principles, but that commitment will have to be renewed by each generation. You can't just create a republic and then expect it to maintain itself." It was sage advice, the wisdom of someone who had seen enough to understand both human potential and human limitation. Publicola thanked him and watched the old senator make his way slowly out of the forum, leaning on a staff, moving through a Rome that had changed more in 1 year than in the previous 20. That night, alone in his residence, Publicola allowed himself to think about what came next. The immediate crises were over, the Republic was established, the procedures were in place, but the work was far from complete. There were still tensions between patricians and plebeians that would need to be addressed. There were still foreign threats from Etruscan cities and Latin neighbours. There were still economic challenges, social problems, administrative inefficiencies. The Republic had survived its first year, but it would face tests in every year that followed, and yet, Publicola felt hopeful. They had proven that change was possible, that tyranny could be overthrown, that free people could govern themselves. They had created institutions and precedents that would guide Rome for generations. They had established principles that future Romans could build upon. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was good enough, and in human affairs, good enough was often all you could hope for. Across Rome that night, other people were having similar thoughts. Ordinary citizens, going about their lives, reflecting on the extraordinary year they had lived through. Merchants grateful that trade had stabilized. Farmers pleased that their property rights were now protected by law rather than royal whim. Soldiers proud that they had fought for something meaningful. Senators relieved that they could speak their minds without fear of execution. And some, inevitably, were unhappy. Patricians who missed the clear hierarchies of monarchy. Ambitious men who resented the limits the Republic placed on personal power. People who genuinely believed Rome had been better under the kings, or who at least preferred the familiarity of monarchy to the uncertainty of this new system. The Republic would have to accommodate all these people. Would have to find ways to satisfy different interests and balance competing demands. That was the price of democracy, of shared governance. Everyone had a voice, even those who disagreed with the system itself. But for tonight, for this moment at the end of Rome's first year as a republic, most Romans were simply grateful to have survived, grateful that the revolution had succeeded, grateful that the Tarquins were gone, grateful that they could call themselves citizens rather than subjects, free men rather than slaves to royal authority. In the Forum, where Lucretia's body had lain just 12 months ago, where Brutus had sworn his oath, where the Republic had been proclaimed, a few late-night travellers moved through the darkness. The space was quiet now, peaceful, showing no signs of the drama it had witnessed, but the memory remained. Romans would not forget what had happened here. They would tell their children about the rape of Lucretia and the death of Brutus. They would pass down stories of the Battle of Silva Arsia and the conspiracy of the young patricians. They would remember the first consuls and the first laws and the first year of freedom. These memories would shape Roman identity for centuries to come. Every Roman schoolboy would learn about 509 BC, would be taught that this was the year Rome chose freedom. Every ambitious politician would measure himself against Brutus and Publicola. Every Roman in times of crisis would ask what those first republicans would have done, how they would have responded, whether they would have had the courage to make the necessary sacrifices. The year 509 BC would become mythologized, certainly. The stories would be embellished, the heroes made more heroic, the villains made more villainous. Brutus would be remembered as the perfect patriot who sacrificed everything for Rome. Tarquin would be remembered as the perfect tyrant who exemplified everything wrong with monarchy. Lucretia would be remembered as the perfect Roman matron whose virtue surpassed even her desire to live. The truth was more complicated, as truth always is. These were real people, flawed and complex, who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. They were brave, certainly, but also scared. They were principled, but also pragmatic. They were heroes, but they were also just humans trying to do the right thing in a world that didn't make it easy. But the simplified version, the mythologized version, would serve Rome well. Nations need founding myths, need heroes to inspire them and villains to warn them. The story of how Rome became a republic, Lucretia's sacrifice, Brutus's oath, the Battle of Silva Arsia, the conspiracy exposed, the Republic preserved, was a good story. More importantly, it was a true story, at least in its essentials, which made it all the more powerful. The Roman Republic would endure for nearly 500 years. It would conquer Italy, then the Mediterranean, then most of the known world. It would create legal systems and governmental structures that would influence human civilization for millennia. It would produce philosophers and generals, poets and architects, statesmen and soldiers who would become legendary. But all of that, all those centuries of achievement and expansion, all those conquests and innovations, would trace back to this single year, to 509 BC, to the moment when Romans decided they would rather govern themselves imperfectly than be governed perfectly by a tyrant. As dawn broke over Rome on the first day of 508 BC, as the city began another day under republican government, it was impossible to know what the future held, whether the Republic would last a year or a decade or a century, whether Rome would prosper or struggle, expand or contract, become a great power or remain a regional city-state. But the Romans of 509 BC had done their part. They had overthrown tyranny. They had established freedom. They had created institutions and precedents that would endure. They had proven that change was possible, that people could govern themselves, that freedom was worth fighting for. The rest was up to future generations. And that really was the most important legacy of all. Not that they had solved every problem or created a perfect system, but that they had shown it was possible to try, to build something better, to choose freedom over subjection. In the Forum, as merchants began setting up their stalls and citizens gathered to hear the day's news and conduct the day's business, Rome continued. The Republic continued. Life continued, as it always did. With all its complications and challenges and possibilities, the age of kings was over. The age of the Republic had begun, and Rome would never be the same. Some endings, it turns out, are really just beginnings. The overthrow of Tarquinius Superbus, the death of Lucius Junius Brutus, the establishment of the consulship, the survival of the Republic through its first year. These were not conclusions to Rome's story, but new chapters in it. The Roman people had chosen their path. Now they would walk it, for better or worse, through triumph and disaster, through glory and defeat, through centuries of history that would reshape the world. But that's a story for another time, for another episode. For now, we leave Rome at the end of 5009 BC, exhausted, bloodied, traumatized by what it had experienced, but also proud, determined, and genuinely free for the first time in its history. The Republic endures. And so, for now, we rest. Sleep well.